Chapter 383. Jianshi knew about the relationship between Su Lu and the new MX Mecha, and also knew how important he was to the military. However, she was still curious about many things about this young man, such as the girl who had testified at Parliament Hill and the minister's daughter who had gotten pregnant before marriage. I thought about it seriously a few days ago. Jianshi raised her eyebrows playfully and said, "You and that minister's daughter have never married, but it seems like no one from the Ministry of Defense has tried to punish you on the spot. Looks like that incident was misreported, or else you were taking the blame for someone else." It had to be said that this national girl would often reveal her lovable side in front of those close to her. But after all, she had lived in the most bizarre circles since she was a child. She was calm when it came to judging people and matters, but she also had a keen eye. In Su Li's mind, the girl in the chair had accompanied him throughout his adolescence, as if they had grown up together. After the initial excitement and awkwardness of meeting the idol of his dreams, that sense of closeness that was deeply rooted in his mind gradually took over. He was silent for a moment, and then he raised his head and said, "About me. This is perhaps a very long story. I don't know if you're interested in continuing to listen." Jianshi did not reply. Instead, she pulled out a third bottle of Katong red wine and filled the 2 glasses on the table with a smile. At the same time, she tilted her head slightly, lifted the purple hair by her ear, and playfully rubbed her earlobes, putting on an adorable expression of all ears. Su Lu scratched his head, trying his best not to be seduced by the sight of her slender fingers rubbing her earlobes. After a short pause, he said, "On the first day I returned to the Capitol Ring, on the bus leaving the airport, I took a bag of puppy biscuits." The story began here. Su Lu, who was narrating all his experiences for the first time, slowly and seriously recounted everything that had happened since he came to the Capitol Ring, including the girl with the black-rimmed glasses, the young spy from the Federation's Investigation Bureau who only liked to smoke number 37 cigarettes and was qualified to enter the Trinity Association, the prince of an aristocratic family who had never eaten scallion pancakes in the Mecha Combat Room of Area H1, and the girl in red who had stopped a black car on the second highway out of the city and cried so hard that her face turned pale. He even talked about the assassination at Linhai State Gymnasium, the creation of the MX Mecha, and many other things that followed. There was no need to keep these things a secret anymore, and he had a need to pour his heart out. In the end, he even vaguely described his escape from Donglin, but he did not go into the details. This conversation went on for an unknown amount of time. The stars outside the spaceship's landing window still emitted a faint light that never changed. The background of the universe seemed to have never changed. Jianshi listened quietly, occasionally taking a sip of the red wine in her glass. She did not say a word, but her slightly narrowed eyes grew brighter and brighter. The lines on Su Li's ordinary face became clearer and clearer. The national idol was not a good listener because she would never ask, "What happened next?" or "What happened next?" What happened next? She would not cover her mouth and make a terrified expression, expressing endless admiration for this bizarre and magnificent life story. So it did not need these things. He just needed to pour his heart out. He needed a quiet, trustworthy, and kind listener. He lowered his head, held the glass of red wine with both hands, and said in a hoarse voice, "When I decided to escape Donglin, the sun was shining brightly that day. There was a lot of dust in the room, like countless insects flying before my eyes. It was also very much like I had contracted the flying grave syndrome. That day just happened to be your 16th birthday, and that evening party was playing on the television." He raised his head, forced a smile, and said, "Actually, the fact that I can remember that today is your birthday had a lot to do with this incident. 3 years ago today was also the day that I decided to leave Donglin." Jianshi sat in the round-backed chair like a child. The thin blanket was draped over her shoulders, and her bare feet were tucked under the hemp garment. She tilted her head and looked at Su Lu with interest. She heard the trace of sadness in the man's last sentence, so she finally broke the silence and asked carefully, "Are you thinking of someone?" "I'm thinking of an uncle." Su Lu looked at Jianshi, lowered his head, and swirled the red wine in his glass. His action of holding the glass with both hands appeared somewhat clumsy. It was because he died that I had to leave Donglin and come to the capital ring. That is why so many things happened after that. Before the uncle died, he told me not to avenge him, but I had to find out who wanted to kill him. But in the end, I found that the enemy should be a cold machine. He gulped down the blood-like wine in the cup and said with a trace of frustration, "Machines don't have any sense of morality. They just work according to the program coldly. Moreover, this machine seems to have a very close relationship with me now. Do I have to destroy it? Or do I have to make it admit its mistake and cry in sorrow and regret? That old thing does not have tear ducts. If he had not drunk so much, Sulu would definitely not have said what he just said. But at this moment, a voice faintly sounded in his mind. Why not? This voice was very illusory and disappeared in the blink of an eye. He, who was drunk, did not notice it. Similarly, Jianshi, who had drunk a lot of red wine and had rosy cheeks, also did not hear anything different from these words. I remember my 16th birthday very clearly. Jianshi, who had drunk at least 2 bottles of Cantong, raised her arms drunkenly and said, "I'm very happy, not because I can finally buy wine to drink, but because that damn old man of mine prepared a trust gift in advance for my 16th birthday. Here, it's this chain. It looks very inconspicuous, but I'm still very happy." Su Li's emotions were still immersed in the sadness of escaping from Donglin. Hearing the word gift, he thought of the big uncle who had kicked him into the sewer and gave him a big gift, the bracelet that allowed him to escape death. He had drunk a little too much, so he moved over and placed his bracelet in front of Jianshui'er. At the same time, he grabbed Jianshui'er's arm and looked curiously at the bracelet. There was a row of very small symbols on the bracelet. Under the faint starlight, if Su Lu was drunk and still had a much sharper vision than normal people, he would definitely not be able to see it. This row of symbols was the ancient alphabet that he had once learned. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take easy song and make it better. Sing a sad song to make the world a better place. Jianshui'er pulled her arm back from Su Li's hand and said with a smile, "So I want to sing. My bracelet also has words engraved on it, but it's a bit old-fashioned, like the stars of virtue." Sulu poured himself another glass of wine and drank it. Looking at the bracelet on the girl's jade-like arm, he suddenly had a very strange feeling in his heart. Perhaps it was because of many similar experiences and details that gave birth to his sense of closeness. "You sing very well." Sulu looked very seriously at the girl in the chair. Looking at her eyelashes that were gradually closing due to drunkenness, he said softly, "You're not a jinx, really." Jianshui'er, who had already entered a drunken stupor, subconsciously replied vaguely, "You don't know. All the disasters and deaths have been with me since I was born. I am a jinx." After waking up, Sister Tong finished washing up. Then, with a serious expression, she asked the sleepy female assistant and confirmed that the door had not been opened. She turned around and went back to her room. She stared at her watch as if she was looking at a bomb that was counting down. Then, she ate 2 breakfasts, drank 3 cups of milk, and did 50 push-ups. She sat in her room and stared blankly for a long time. However, she still could not make up her mind on what to do. Right now, it was 4:30 in the morning. She should have been sleeping in bed, but she could not sleep. This was because she knew that the miss invited Su Lu to her room yesterday, and it had been so long, but the man still had not come out. This fact made her very anxious. However, even if something happened between this young man and woman, it was the result of the tacit consent or even the indulgence of the elders. Should she interrupt? At this moment, Sister Tong could not help but sympathize with the young master of the Li family, who had not even held the miss's hand. 17 minutes passed. For her, it felt like 17 hours had passed. She finally could not wait any longer. If the people on the spaceship found out that Su Lu left the miss's room early in the morning, if this matter spread, what would happen to the reputation of the nation's young girls? How could she survive in the literary circle in the future? She took out the spare key and opened the door. When she opened the door, she was slightly relieved because the young miss was sleeping on the bed, and the person she was worried about, Su Lu, was looking at the stars and the universe in a daze by the window, holding a glass of red wine with both hands, and there were actually 9 empty bottles on the carpet in the room. Under Sister Tong's murderous gaze, Su Lu rubbed his eyebrows awkwardly and walked out of the room. In fact, his alcohol tolerance was not high. The two drank 10 bottles of Katong red wine in one night. Jian Shui'er was already drunk. He also woke up after getting drunk. He had a terrible headache. He walked through the core area passage with a dry mouth. In the quiet corridor in the early morning, only his voice could be heard. However, when he quietly walked down the gangway ladder, he was shocked by the scene in front of him. His legs turned to jelly, and he almost fell. The living area under the ladder was full of people. It was not yet 5 o'clock in the morning. People who were supposed to be resting in their cabins were actually resisting the urge to sleep and waiting for something. Most people had even fallen asleep on the sofa. "He's here! He's here!" Someone shouted loudly. The originally quiet living area was suddenly awakened. Everyone rubbed their eyes and looked at the gangway ladder. A spaceship officer stood up and looked at the military timer in his hand. He said loudly, 15 hours, 33 minutes, 42 seconds. From the moment Su Lu walked into Jian Shui'er's room, the busybodies on the spaceship began to count down. Many people even resisted the urge to sleep and wanted to see the end of this good show. As the time announcement ended, the soldiers in the resting area stood up and naturally opened up a path. Looking at Su Lu on the ladder, they began to enthusiastically applaud. There were also ear-piercing cheers and whistles in the middle. The applause was warm and the whistles were everywhere. The resting area in the early morning was very lively. Su Lu looked at these people stiffly. He was even more shocked to find that not only were the busybodies and the men of Group 7 in the resting area, even the highest commander of the spaceship, Captain Yi Xiaotong, was here in person. This female captain with a poker face was holding a cup of hot coffee. She smiled and raised the cup to congratulate Su Lu. Chapter 384. Jian Shui'er was the one and only national idol in the Federation. She had never deliberately flaunted her purity, but she was a treasure that countless uncles in the universe held in their hands. She was a treasure that they would never allow to be desecrated. To be more precise, those uncles realized that they would never be able to come into contact with this purple-haired little girl. Naturally, they did not want anyone younger, wealthier, or more handsome than them to be able to touch her. Unlike most of the other stars, most of the people in the Federation had watched Jian Shui'er first appear on the screen when she was 12 years old. Then, she grew up on TV day after day. They watched the lawsuit that rocked the Federation. They watched her grow from a little girl to a young girl, and then she became the most dazzling existence. This kind of long-term interaction and the feeling of watching her grow up made the people in the Federation subconsciously treat her as a family member. It seemed that no one wanted to see this lovely elf grow up, and they were even more unwilling to think that she would eventually have a love life one day. What comforted countless uncles and aunties was that the national girl had never been involved in any scandals. Since she was 16 years old, her private life was still mysterious and pure. Nothing in the world of fame and fortune had affected her, and it was impossible for there to be any melodramatic love story. Under such a big environment, countless people in the living area of the battleship had witnessed it with their own eyes. Su Lu, this seemingly ordinary young security director, had actually entered Jian Shui'er's boudoir in front of everyone. He had even spent a night there for 14 hours. Looking at the mess in front of her, Captain Yin Xiaotong smiled gently. She did not want to embarrass Su Lu too much, so she held the coffee cup and coughed softly twice. The supreme commander of the battleship had spoken. The soldiers in the lounge who wished for the world to be in chaos gradually stopped cheering and whistling. However, they did not stop applauding. Su Lu rubbed his forehead awkwardly as he walked down the gangway with an uncoordinated body. Jian Shui'er's personal team had already lowered their heads and returned to their own rooms. The soldiers on the battleship and the guys from Group 7 all stood up from the sofa. Everyone deliberately maintained their silence and stood upright, looking straight ahead. Their military postures were solemn as they clapped. It was as if they were welcoming a chief who had come for inspection, or as if they were welcoming an unparalleled general who had returned from a bloody battle. Being able to pluck the most tender flower in the Federation was no different from winning a great battle. In fact, this fruit of victory was even more attractive. Such a scene would probably only appear on a warship with a dense military aura. If it were any other place, what greeted Sulu would definitely not be the glorious applause and welcome, but countless murderous gazes and hidden weapons that would take his life from the shadows. However, this kind of deliberate welcome hid a meaning that made Sulu feel the most helpless. These bastards. He did not look like a victorious general. With his head lowered, he looked like a deserter. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that many people's faces were almost unable to hold back their smiles, especially Lan Xiaolong and Gu Shifeng. Their faces were already red. After going through untold hardships to quickly walk to the lounge, he let out a sigh of relief. He saluted Captain Yi Xiaotong, who was leaning against the door, and explained with a bitter face, "Don't misunderstand." Captain Yi Xiaotong picked up a coffee cup and took a sip. She shrugged and said, "I'm just here to watch the show. You don't have to explain anything to me." Sulu turned around and looked at the people in the lounge. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Don't misunderstand, everyone." No one paid attention to him. Lan Xiaolong looked straight ahead and clapped with a fixed rhythm. He lowered his voice and said to the men from Group 7, "Although it's definitely very honorable to follow such a leader, but all the good cabbages are taken by him. What are we going to do?" Xiong Linquan was more honest and said, "Didn't the leader say that this was a misunderstanding?" "Misunderstanding my ass." Lan Xiaolong said angrily, "Why don't you let me go and misunderstand Jian Shui'er for a night? Besides, didn't you see how lewd that bastard was smiling just now?" Being misunderstood as having a romantic relationship with the nation's girl, Jian Shui'er, was the most beautiful kind of misunderstanding. Just as Lan Xiaolong said, any normal man who encountered the situation that Su Lu encountered in the early morning would inevitably feel a little smug in the depths of their hearts, along with an indescribable feeling of sweetness. Although after some reflection, Su Lu knew that this kind of thinking was wrong. At least he did not take Jian Shui'er's feelings and reputation into consideration. However, he thought about it again. If it was a blind date, what was there to be afraid of being misunderstood? The so-called men or boys. During the rest of the journey, the people on the spaceship gradually got used to Su Lu being called upstairs to Jian Shui'er's room, although he did not set such an earth-shattering record of 14 hours. People were shocked to find that the nation's girl was probably really in love. If they were not on a spaceship, they would definitely immediately share this explosive news with all their family and friends. Then, the entire Federation might be in a mess. However, only the people involved knew that the truth was not so. After that night of drinking wine, Su Lu and Jian Shui'er, whom he was protecting, did indeed become much closer to each other. However, they were just friends who could talk to each other. They were far from having any romantic feelings. In Su Li's eyes, Jian Shui'er was still an existence that was extremely distant. In Jian Shui'er's heart, this person who was asked to go on a blind date by her family. As long as the word blind date came to mind, the girl would inexplicably feel conflicted and did not want to think about these problems. The storm on the spaceship finally came to an end because of the evening party. Jian Shui'er walked down from the core floor and came to the rest area to have fun with everyone. She even stood on a very small stage and sang 3 songs for everyone. Seeing the nation's girl in front of them, the officers were shocked. They stood under the small stage and desperately took photos. However, they collectively became shy and no one dared to approach her. Then, they heard Jian Shui'er's witty and cute explanation. Only then did they truly believe that nothing had happened between her and the small-eyed security chief. It was very strange. When Su Lu said the same explanation, no one would believe it. Instead, they would think that he was a pervert and hypocrite. Jian Shui'er just said it with a faint smile, and everyone on the spaceship believed it from the bottom of their hearts. Su Lu stood in a corner far away from the stage and sipped his milk tea. Looking at the young female celebrity who caused the commotion on the spaceship, a hint of a sincere smile appeared on his face. With Jian Shui's status in the Federation, there was originally no need for her to explain anything to these people. This was a request he had made carefully yesterday. He believed that from today onwards, no one would bother him again. However, for some reason, after hearing that explanation, he felt a faint sense of regret in his heart. After the evening party, Jian Shui once again boarded the control hall on the highest floor of the spaceship, causing another commotion. Although the officers on duty could not leave their posts, they could not help but turn their head from time to time to look at the purple-haired girl sitting in the captain's seat. Su Lu, who was standing behind Jian Shui, was even very worried at this moment. If a meteorite appeared in front of them, would no one be able to detect the alarm of the spaceship's central control system, and he would be knocked over? This was a very symbolic scene. Jian Shui's most distinct image in the Federation was that of the young female spaceship commander in the dark brown lieutenant colonel uniform. Today, she was really sitting in the captain's seat. If the reporters could take a photo of this, they would definitely be able to exchange for a large apartment in the port city. This was definitely against the Federation military regulations, but Captain Yi Xiaodong only watched from the side gently and even explained how to operate Jian Shui. No one on the spaceship was willing to spoil the mood and raise any objections. If I were the military police, I could have arrested you just now. Su Lu looked forward and said softly. Jian Shui, who was sitting in the captain's seat, did not turn around. She only said softly, I used 1.5 years to get my graduation certificate from the Battleship Command Department of No. 1 Academy. I'm not breaking any rules by sitting here. The National Maiden's rebuttal had a little bit of pride and smugness, but then her voice became light. It's a pity that perhaps I will never be able to truly command a spaceship in my life, even if it's a retired feather rank. Su Lu was shocked at first, but then he felt the trace of sadness in her words and fell silent. Jingwei 2 was the second satellite orbiting a giant planet. This small planet was not the main administrative planet of the Westwoods region, but it was the most suitable planet for human habitation in the region. The oxygen content in the air was very suitable. Because of the distance from the star and the gravitational force of the giant planet, the day and night were a little chaotic, but the climate was very pleasant. At the edge of the grassland, where the planet shone for the longest time, there was a large manor. It was the ancestral property of the Zhong family in the Westwoods. On this day, at the outer space base of the manor, a handsome young man of about 25 or 26 years old threw away the golf club in his hand and looked at the subordinate beside him in disbelief. He said, You said, Jian Shui is coming to the Westwoods? My favorite Jian Shui? Why didn't I know? I heard it's a concert for the military. It was arranged by the military. The news just came from the ancestral home. A trace of ruthlessness flashed across the young man's face. He said, Arrange a spaceship immediately. I want to go back. Yes, young master. The subordinate said hesitantly, but it said that Miss Jian Shui's team will only stay on the main planet for 3 days. I don't know if it's in time. Of course it's in time. The young man spread out his hands and looked at the star in the sky and the vast edge of the main planet. He took a deep breath and said with great fascination, I've been locked up in the Westwoods. I can't go to the capital ring. Now that Jian Shui is here, of course I have to give her the warmest welcome and let her stay by my side forever. The subordinate wanted to persuade him, but when he thought of the cold and barbaric character of the young master, and that the one in the ancestral home had gone to the front line, he could only keep quiet and began to sympathize with the national girl who was popular across the universe. Today is Christmas Eve, so I'm going to eat and watch a movie with the leaders. I didn't mention a certain someone this time. You guys are not going to ask me to kneel on the keyboard again, right? Horizontal. Chapter 385. The Federation Type 2 battleship had the super ability to continuously travel in and out of the atmosphere. The microporous interlayer under the surface of the battleship had a cooling spray technology that turned the water vapor in the air into tiny droplets that covered every inch of the battleship's surface. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and the sun in the west woods had just risen. It shone from the west and landed on the surface of the battleship. It shone brightly like diamond shavings. The huge body of the battleship with a crystal-clear surface was like an ancient god that squeezed through the layers of thick clouds in the sky and slowly landed on the military base below. Accompanied by a dull humming sound, a gust of wind as high as level 12 suddenly appeared on the Silin Changfeng military base's #1 landing platform. The ground that had been cleaned up a long time ago abruptly rolled up countless fine dust. 41 jet stabilized landing gear landed steadily and slowly on the ground, but it still seemed to make the ground tremble slightly. A huge shadow suddenly shrouded the surroundings. The space battleship that carried the crew of the Victory Concert finally set foot on the land of the West Woods after a long space journey. The officers of the military base had received a top-secret order from the Ministry of Defense 2 months ago. They had seen so many space battleships taking off and landing on the ground that they had long been accustomed to it. But when they thought of the National Girl in the Type 2 battleship, even they who were close to 50 years old and had high authority still felt a trace of curiosity and gratitude. He was curious about the most popular star in the universe. He was grateful that this big star had crossed the galaxy to come here and worked hard to help him. But because of the confidentiality order from the Ministry of Defense, the officers of the Changfeng military base did not reveal the true mission of the space battleship. Thousands of ground logistics officers and soldiers in the base still did not know who was in the battleship. Otherwise, the base would have been in chaos today. The command room of the battleship finished connecting with the base and signed the relevant electronic documents. A fleet of more than 20 professional vehicles drove down from the passageway under the space battleship. Compared to the enormous size of the battleship, these vehicles looked pitifully small. Sulu got out of the driver's seat of the black car and lowered his head to look behind him. He noticed that Miss Jianshui was reading today's newspaper. He immediately raised his head and admired the battleship that had accompanied him for many days. The Federation's newest model, the second-generation warship, looked like a giant building block made of countless metal boxes. Because its body was too large, it was anchored on the surface of the base. Its shadow spread out continuously, with no end in sight. It gave off an extremely shocking feeling. Isn't it a little too extravagant to take so many vehicles on a space trip? Sulu thought to himself as he watched the fleet of vehicles leave one after another. He was born in Donglin. Naturally, he knew best how scarce the resources of crystal mines in the Federation were. For the sake of a concert, they might have to use up 2 months' worth of energy from a civilian space navigation company. In his opinion, it was not worth it. The low-frequency humming sound had already ended, and the gales that filled the sky had long since subsided. Sulu stood below the gigantic warship, narrowed his eyes, and looked up. Looking at the Federation's most terrifying gigantic weapon, he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions in his heart. This was his first time coming to the West Forest region. In the legends, this was the frontline region where the Federation and the Empire were entangled, where smoke filled the sky, where blood flowed like rivers. However, in the gentle morning breeze of the West Woods, he narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath of the fresh air. His gaze passed under the battleship and looked into the distance. Under the morning sun, on the other landing platforms of the Changfeng military base, more than 10 Federation battleships were taking off. Because they were very far away, they looked like more than a dozen small black dots. Also, the powerful roar of the crystal engines of those battleships could not be heard. However, one could imagine the busy and nervous soldiers on the landing platforms over there. Looking at this tense and solemn scene, Sulu faintly felt a sense of war that oppressed his heart. Sign this document, and then we will say goodbye. Captain Yi Xiaotong smiled and walked to Su Li's side. She handed over an electronic document and asked him to sign it. Su Lu took it in confusion and looked at the top-secret catalog listed on the electronic document. His body suddenly froze, and then he slowly raised his head. He frowned and looked at the exit of the battleship that was being lifted to the heavy-duty truck platform behind him. He stared at the box that was about to land on the platform and asked in shock, "Why are you giving this to me?" This box was extremely large, so much so that it felt incomparably exaggerated. It could at least fit several armored vehicles inside. The surface of the box was painted with dark green military paint, but it was unknown what was inside. This is an order from the Ministry of Defense. Don't ask me. Although Captain Yi Xiaodong had a poker face, she was actually a very gentle female officer. She smiled and said, "But I think that the Ministry of Defense must feel that you are definitely the most experienced in controlling it. You want to protect Miss Jian Shuier well in the Westwoods, especially at the front lines you will be arriving at in a few days. With it by your side, you have a higher chance of success." Su Lu laughed bitterly. He thought to himself, the Federation's top-secret MX Mecha being handed over to a concert security director just like that. No one would believe this if he told this to anyone. The Ministry of Defense really trusted him so much. After signing the papers, Su Lu looked at the MX Mecha in the box again. He asked Captain Yi Xiaodong, "Where are you going next?" Captain Yi Xiaodong smiled and said, "After sending you all to the Westwoods Frontline Command will be responsible for arranging your itinerary. As for us," she turned her head and glanced proudly at the giant warship and said, "We are going to join the Federal Fleet and go to the Night Scorpion Nebula to join the ranks of those sealing off the space channel. This big kid needs an official name." The rules of the Federal Fleet were as such. Warships that had not been to the front lines and had not made any contributions in battle, no matter how advanced or powerful they were, could not have their own names. They could only have a serial number. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then raised his right hand and saluted the captain. He said, "I wish you all the best at the front lines." "Definitely." Captain Yi Xiaodong calmly returned the salute. At this time, the base was extremely busy. Jianshi naturally could not get down from the black car and caused trouble for the military. She sat quietly in the back and read the newspaper. Occasionally, she would look up and see what Su Lu was doing outside the car. Although she did not hear what Su Lu said to Captain Yi Xiaodong, she knew that Captain Yi was about to leave. A faint and complicated feeling surged in her heart. She waved at the middle-aged female captain through the glass. The main administrative planet of the Westwoods region only had 5 administrative states. The victory concert was not held here, but at the more dangerous frontline planet. In the itinerary planned by the Department of Defense, Jian Shuier and her team would adjust here for 3 days to adapt to the slightly different environment of the capital ring. After that, they would head to Planet 5460. The Department of Defense arranged for them to stay in the Department of Defense's office in the Westwoods. The name was very common, but it was the most expensive and most secretive hotel in the Westwoods region. The war between the Federation and the Empire had been going on for a long time. This hotel had to continuously receive high-ranking military officers from the capital ring. Whether it was the facilities or the security, it was second to none on this planet. "Are you feeling better?" Su Lu asked with concern. He let the car's central control system automatically adjust the oxygen content in the car and the massage system of the seat. He looked at the rear-view screen and asked with concern. Jian Shuier, who was sitting in the back, gently lifted the purple hair on her cheek. Although her eyebrows were still slightly furrowed, she did not want to worry too many people, so she nodded softly. Humans had always been lucky in the universe. Before they met the Empire, the colonial planets they developed among the stars were always suitable for human habitation, which made the Creator jealous. Especially the 3 main administrative planets of the capital ring, the natural environment was basically the same. Even philosophers could not explain this problem. The environment of the main administrative planet of the Westwoods region was also more suitable for human physiology. However, the oxygen content in the air and the planet's gravity were higher than the capital rings. Su Lu had been practicing the 10 postures for a long time, so his body had an extremely strong power. Naturally, he did not feel these problems, but for ordinary people like Jian Shuier, it was still a little uncomfortable to be here for the first time. Although the itinerary was still confidential, Su Lu was very careful. Just like when he left the villa on MT Autumn, he and Jian Shuier sat alone in this inconspicuous black car, while Sister Tong sat in the Silver Fox. He did not really expect to be able to fish in troubled waters, but he always cautiously hoped that if something really happened, everyone would have more time to react. The main administrative planet of the Westwoods region was still very far away from the real front line. Originally, they should not be as cautious as they were now, but for some reason, Sulu always felt that there was a shadow in his heart. Perhaps it was because the Department of Defense had actually thrown an MX next to him, or perhaps it was because, after drinking that day, Jian Shuier kept saying that he was a jinx. He shook his head, laughed at himself, and threw this nonsense to the back of his mind. However, almost at the same time he shook his head, the car radar next to the steering wheel suddenly emitted a sharp warning sound. Jian Shuier, who was sitting in the back, was gently rubbing between her eyebrows when she suddenly heard the sound. She could not help but be startled and asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. There's a small problem with the sound system. I was going to play a piano piece for you." "No need," Jian Shuier said with a smile. Sulu said calmly, but his eyes were already fixed on the car's holographic screen. The central control system made the identification in a very short time. The alarm was not triggered by a high-speed positioning long-range weapon, nor was it due to the approaching aircraft. Instead, it was due to the appearance of a dangerous high-speed object on the right side of the road. It could be a car that was chasing after the convoy, but its speed was terrifying. The news that Jian Shuier had arrived in the Westwoods on a spaceship should still be confidential. If the other party was really coming for the convoy, it could only mean that the news had already been leaked. Chapter 386. This was a special highway leading from the Changfeng military base to the state capital. Because countless tons of military equipment had to be transported and deployed through this special highway all year round, the design of the road had an astonishingly large load capacity. The blackened and flat road, the design of the hard cement without the automatic heating structure, and the fully enclosed high elastic anti-collision walls on both sides of the road allowed the design speed of this highway to reach up to 360 kilometers per hour. These two numbers actually exceeded most of the highest-level roads in the capital ring. But today, Su Li's fleet was not traveling fast, never exceeding 80 kilometers per hour. On the one hand, it was because there were too many professional vehicles in the fleet, but more importantly, it was because of the existence of the heavy multi-axle heavy truck in the fleet. The fleet was moving together with this huge monster, so it was impossible to increase their speed. Especially when Sulu issued a warning to the members of Group 7 from the black car that there was a vehicle approaching at high speed, the entire fleet, under the leadership of the 7 dark green military vehicles, not only did not speed up, but instead slowed down a little. Fortunately, the officers of the Changfeng military base had done traffic control on the special highway in advance. Except for the vehicle that was approaching at high speed through some unknown means, there were no other vehicles on the special highway. Otherwise, they would have been extremely dissatisfied with the fleet that was as slow as a snail. At the same time the warning was issued, the vehicle with the radar warning had already caught up to the rear of the fleet. This was an extended white Duran brand limousine. Not to mention what kind of wealth this style of Duran represented. Just the modified exterior decoration was already extremely luxurious. On the black highway in the morning, it was like a group of treasures whistling through the air. Sulu put on his sunglasses again and didn't turn his head to look. He also didn't immediately get his subordinates to react violently. After all, this white Duran limousine hadn't shown any hostility yet. Moreover, he believed that if the other party was here for Jian Shuier, they definitely wouldn't have thought that the nation's young lady was sitting behind him in this inconspicuous black car. However, this white limousine roared and slowed down beside Su Li's black car, moving side by side with the black car. At the same time, a voice sounded from the car speaker. "We warmly welcome Miss Jian Shuier to the Westwoods. It seems to be one of your admirers." Sulu frowned and looked at his left hand. The extended Duran limousine was constantly playing a warm welcome speech, and a poem appeared on the ultra-thin holographic screen on the side of the limousine. Yes, it looked strange, but there was indeed someone who had the money and time to do such a thing to an extremely expensive Duran limousine so that he could write some nondescript words on it. The white limousine said, "You are my rose, you are my flower, You are my lover. You are my concern." Underneath this naked confession was the signature of the owner of the car. Zichi respectfully, "I hope to meet Miss Jianshuier today and have a good time together." Jianshuier opened her eyes wide and looked at this scene curiously. When she saw what was written on it, she couldn't help but frown slightly. She lowered her voice and muttered, "Vulgar. It is indeed vulgar." Sula nodded in agreement. This should be a new poem by a certain Academy poet of the Federation. It was not a pear blossom style, but it was better than a pear blossom style, and it was disgusting. But for him, disgust was a small matter, and the vigilance in his heart grew stronger. How did that car break into the special traffic control lane? And how did it know that Jian Shuier was in this black car? "Do you know this, Mr. Zichi?" "No." "How do you want to deal with this?" Sula looked forward and asked. "You deal with it." Jian Shuier gave a simple answer, and then continued to read the newspaper with her head down. It seemed that she trusted Su Li's ability to deal with this kind of trivial matter. Although this was the first time she had left the capital ring, in the short 19 years of her life, she had encountered many strange and unusual things. Sula narrowed his eyes and looked at the strange car on the side of the road. Through the car system, he said softly, "The itinerary has been exposed. Now we will merge." The special road out of the base was a one-way, three-lane road. Following Su Li's order, the snake-like convoy gradually separated. Several military vehicles controlled by Group 7 moved to the side of the road, allowing the black car to enter the middle of the convoy. At the same time, 3 military vehicles quickly moved to the back, blocking the white limousine behind the convoy. Sula did not relax. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the heavy truck not far in front of him that was moving slowly between the convoy. The multi-axle truck was more than 30 meters long, and on it was a large box about 4 meters tall. It looked abnormally heavy. In the entire convoy, only he knew what was inside the box. Although he was Jian Shuiyer's head of security and would definitely put the safety of this nation's maiden first and foremost, that box contained the MX Mecha. The car behind might belong to one of Jian Shuiyer's wealthy admirers, but the various suspicious points still made him cautious. He could not allow that car to get close to the multi-axle truck and pose a threat to the Federation's most advanced MX Mecha. This was the West Woods, the frontline region between the Federation and the Empire. Who knew if there were any Empire spies who could penetrate the light of the Charter? No one knew if there were any seeds of the Empire that had taken root and sprouted here. He had to be careful in everything. The one-way, three-lane road was completely blocked by 3 dark green military vehicles. The white limousine had no choice but to slow down. The driver, wearing a black standard-brimmed hat, looked at the scene in shock. He asked his superior beside him, "It looks like there's a military escort. What's wrong with the military? We're not from the Empire." The middle-aged man, sitting in the passenger seat, watched as the black car gradually disappeared into the middle of the convoy. He could not help but frown. Today, he was fully in charge of the task of welcoming Miss Jian Shuier. Even if he could not invite that nation's maiden into the car, he should at least open a path for the convoy. How could he be blocked at the back? Moreover, in his opinion, the dark green military vehicles blocking the road were just for show. They did not even dare to hang a decent military plate. They were probably employees of some security company in the capital ring. In the land of the West Woods, even the most powerful people in the capital ring had to be careful. The middle-aged man thought with a serious expression. What kind of person was the young master? Naturally, he wouldn't personally welcome this so-called star. However, if he couldn't handle this matter properly and leave a deep impression in the star's heart for the young master, he really didn't know if he could live until tomorrow. "Squeeze in." The middle-aged man waved his hand in annoyance and gave the order. In his opinion, these so-called bodyguards and security companies should know that he represented the family force as long as they saw the Z license plate hanging on his limousine. They would definitely not dare to stop him. Just as the white limousine was about to forcibly overtake the convoy, a soft voice came from the military vehicle in the middle at the back of the convoy. "The military is carrying out a mission. All unrelated vehicles, please slow down immediately and do not interfere with the convoy's progress. Bayulan gently put down the communicator and stared at the rear-view screen with a pair of daggers. As a person who often did private work in Serene, he knew better than anyone what kind of power Initial Z's license plate represented in this barren land far away from the capital ring. However, he was now Su Li's assistant, and no power could make his heartstrings tighten in the slightest. Besides, Su Lu had said earlier that this was a military mission. In a military mission, any vehicle that tried to interfere with the convoy's progress could be killed on the spot. The middle-aged man in the white limousine knew this very well. However, in the land of the West Woods, his family had been in the limelight for too long. They did not even take the president of the Federation seriously. How could he be scared off by a single sentence from Bayulan? The middle-aged man heard the warning from the military vehicle in front of him and waved his hand indifferently. The white limousine instantly accelerated. In less than 2 seconds, it was ready to speed up from 30 kilometers per hour and catch up with the convoy. In the dark green military vehicle, Lu Jiao turned his head to look at Bayulan and said, "It seems to be that family's car." Bayulan looked forward and said softly, "We are carrying out a mission. Do you want me to teach you what to do?" Lu Jiao's heart tightened, and he cursed a few times. Then, he slammed on the brakes and turned the steering wheel back. The auxiliary balancing system instantly entered into position. The dark green military vehicle, under his excellent control, was like a battleship that suddenly fell apart. It instantly lost speed and swerved horizontally to block the special road. The white limousine could not react in time and slammed into the dark green military painting that was swerving horizontally. Although the 7 military vehicles did not have military plates, they were more advanced and powerful than the standard military vehicles of the Department of Defense. The equipment for this trip was personally applied by Bayulan. The shell company did not care about the cost at all. The 7 military vehicles looked very ordinary, but in fact, they were all equipped with mechanical rams under the surface of the vehicles. As for the chassis, it was made of a super strong alloy chassis. In the words of Master Schiller's absurd comedy, it looked like a razor, but in fact, it was a hairdryer. It looked like an ordinary military vehicle, but in fact, it was a heavy armored vehicle. Unsurprisingly, the white Duran limousine slammed into the rear of the military vehicle. With a loud bang, the body of the vehicle was suddenly crushed and twisted. It looked like a crispy biscuit. It was horrible to look at. Although the speed was only 40 kilometers per hour, such a direct and brutal collision with a trace of primitive ruthlessness still turned this unimaginably expensive white limousine into a pile of scrap metal. "Follow the convoy," Bayulan said softly. Lu Jiao nodded and silently stepped on the gas pedal. He drove the military vehicle that only had a few scratches on its paint. During this process, from the beginning to the end, they did not look back at all. They did not care about the 2 people who were covered in blood and embarrassed as they crawled out of the limousine. Chapter 387. The middle-aged man covered his bleeding forehead and crawled out of the car in a daze. He stared blankly at the motorcade that was roaring away. Because he was too dizzy from the crash, his legs were weak as he stood on the road. He did not understand what had happened at all. Although the white Duran limousine was not as powerful as the special military vehicle that Nutshell Mobility had spared no expense to build, it was still the result of the most advanced technology in the Federation. Its safety features were excellent. Therefore, although the body of the limousine was severely deformed and twisted like the fried dough of an S3, the middle-aged man and the driver were not in any life-threatening danger. They were only bruised and bleeding. Fortunately, Jian Shuainer's motorcade had been traveling at an extremely slow speed. The relative speed at the time of the crash was definitely not more than 70 kilometers per hour. The middle-aged man was a butler. This butler was a person with a very high status in the West Woods. He had never been to the capital ring and had never interacted with the other members of the 7 great families. In his opinion, his family was definitely a godlike existence in the West Woods. He was used to relying on his family to be high and mighty. Previously, when he was brutally knocked over by the other party's military vehicle, he still could not recognize the fact until he crawled out of the limousine. After a long time, the middle-aged man finally woke up with a trembling body. Looking at the motorcade that was long gone, he stamped his feet nervously, lifted the hem of his white suit, and carelessly wiped the blood on his forehead. With a sobbing voice, he called his young master. "You idiot, didn't you reveal your identity?" A young man's calm voice with infinite pride came from the other end of the phone. "You can't even do such a small thing." They said they were on some military mission, but they could at least see the license plate of the limousine. The middle-aged butler said with a bitter face. He could not understand this matter. The conspicuous Z on the white Duran limousine's license plate represented an extremely prominent family name in the Westwoods. Why would a mere Federation Stars motorcade dare to use such a barbaric and bloody method to stop him? "You're saying that they know who you represent?" On the other end of the phone, the young man's voice became cruel and rude. He said gloomily, "A star came to the military, but those guys in the Capitol ring are so mysterious. Get your ass back here. Don't embarrass yourself. I'm preparing a welcome party in the hotel. I'll give you an explanation then." Standing next to the white Duran limousine that was in tatters and smoking, the middle-aged butler was about to kneel down. He said humbly, "Young master, a nobody like me doesn't need an explanation. I just can't let you be wronged." The middle-aged man couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The bodyguards of the celebrity team seemed to be too tough, but in the blink of an eye, he calmed down. No matter how tough they were, they could only kneel on the ground and beg for mercy when they met the people they served. The white limousine caused a mess. Regardless of whether the person who signed the letter Ziki was an admirer of Jian Shu'er, it at least confirmed one thing. Jian Shu'er's itinerary, which was arranged by the Department of Defense, had been seriously leaked the moment they set foot in the Westwoods, or even before that. Because of this, Su Lu was vigilant. He did not listen to the reports from his subordinates at the back. Instead, he directly ordered the entire motorcade to speed up. Before noon, according to the charter map, they passed through the ring highway of the capital of Sunset State and arrived at the Venus Hotel by the sea. The name of the Venus Hotel was very cliché, but the extremely conspicuous sign at the front door of the hotel, the dazzling star of the Federal Army, easily drove away all the cliché, leaving only a sense of awe and power, because this was the Westwoods office of the Department of Defense of the Federation. In the past few decades, the Venus Hotel was not only responsible for receiving countless high-ranking military officers who came to participate in the Rotation War, but it also played a more important role. It was the guiding and coordinating organization between the Federation government and the local political forces of the Westwoods region. The motorcade drove into the open parking lot behind the Venus Hotel. Not far away, they could see the clear blue sea water and the silvery white beach through the palm trees. Although there weren't many girls playing in the water under the noon sun, hovercraft could be seen from time to time on the white waves of the sea. The professional sound, lighting, and computer equipment needed for the concert did not need to be unloaded. The professional security equipment on the military vehicles were all transferred down and began to be deployed along the weak points of the hotel's defense. This was a military hotel. Logically speaking, it should be very safe, but Magnolia, who was in charge of the security measures, did not relax. Group 7 had the security authority issued by the Department of Defense, so the hotel's military security department could only watch as they tormented their own expensive facilities, unable to stop them. Jian Shu'er was still wearing the casual sportswear with the hoodie. The wide brim of the hoodie covered her striking purple hair, and the loose-fitting clothes made the girl's body appear particularly petite. Su Lu wore sunglasses and walked beside her in silence along a pre-marked path. They walked into the hotel from the back door and prepared to take the direct elevator to the luxury suite on the top floor. Amid countless crisp electronic beeps, everyone went through the Federation's electronic monitoring network's second-level identity verification process. Being in the Westwoods, the identity check was obviously more stringent than the Capitol Ring. 7 of the members of Group 7 were under the command of Gu Shifeng to set up the electronic security settings. At this time, there were not many people around Jian Shui'er, so it did not take too long. Everything was going smoothly, but when they stood in the luxurious corridor and waited for the special elevator, an accident that no one expected happened. The wooden door at the end of the corridor that looked unusually calm suddenly opened on both sides. Pleasant music and warm applause poured in with a whoosh. The music suddenly started, and Su Lu quickly moved. Before anyone could react, he blocked Jian Shui'er behind him. On his left, Magnolia, who had been lowering her head, also quickly put her right hand in her trouser pocket, ready to throw the beautiful military knife at any time. The rest of the members of Group 7 reacted slower, but it still took them less than half a second to grab the weapons hidden in their clothes and travel bags. "Welcome to the Westwoods, Miss Jian Shui'er." An MC's enthusiastic and excited voice came from outside the door. Then the music stopped, and thunderous applause came from the hall at the end of the corridor. Dozens of men and women in luxurious clothes smiled and walked to both sides of the door as if they were lining up to welcome something. Sister Tong's face was gloomy. She stared at the reception officer of the Gold Star Hotel and asked, "What's going on?" Jian Shui'er had originally come to the West Woods secretly. The venue of the Victory concert was far away on the terrifying planet at the front line, so the route and itinerary should have been kept a secret. However, she was discovered as soon as she left the military base. At this moment, they had been preparing to quietly go upstairs to rest, but someone had found out in advance and prepared a welcome reception in advance. If the reception officer of the Gold Star Hotel had not leaked the secret, how could the host of the reception have calculated the time so accurately? No wonder Sister Tong's eyes were murderous at this moment. "Hello, Miss Jian Shui'er. Today's reception is specially organized for you by our friends in the Westwoods. I hope you can do us the honor." At this moment, a young man, accompanied by a few elders, walked through the door and came in front of everyone. The young man's face was handsome, but his slightly large nose was a little dazzling. He was wearing an expensive, custom-made garment from the Gu clothing store in Hong Kong. He looked very refreshing. When he saw Jian Shui'er surrounded by the crowd, Jian Shui'er was wearing a hat and sportswear. She kept her head down and didn't say anything. He couldn't see anything at all. The greed and amazement in his eyes gushed out and couldn't be concealed. In fact, this young man, who had come from Wei Air, did not care to hide the greed in his eyes at all, because he had this privilege in the West Woods. The few older men beside this young master introduced themselves. One of them was actually the governor of the Sunset region, and the other was the vice chairman of the West Forest Region's management committee. They were all very important people. The young man smiled and walked in front of everyone. He did not think that Jian Shui'er would reject his invitation at all, because the reception had already started and countless guests were waiting, and the people who came with him were all big shots in the West Woods political circle. Whether it was in terms of appearance or ostentation, Jian Shui'er, even if she was the most popular national girl in the universe, she could not just leave under such circumstances. So he gently reached out and wanted to shake Jian Shui'er's hand in a very gentlemanly manner. It would be best if he could give her a West Woods-style kiss on the hand. However, his hand was gently pushed away indifferently. Sula glanced at Jian Shui'er and saw her slightly shake her head imperceptibly. He did not pay any attention to the young man who was approaching him and directly said to the reception officer of the Gold Star Hotel, "I think you need to explain to the Department of Defense." Then he very naturally pushed away the hand that came out of nowhere and was reaching for his blind date. "I'm very sorry. Miss Jian Shui'er is tired. She won't be joining the reception." Sula looked at the people in front of him and said politely. He said it matter-of-factly, and the expressions of the big shots in the West Woods also changed, especially the young man. His smile became cold as he looked at Su Lu and said, "Who are you to make decisions for Miss Jian Shui'er? I'm the head of security, and I'm on a military mission." The young man raised his eyebrows and smiled slightly, as if he had heard something very interesting. Then the smile on his face gradually disappeared, and he said coldly, "Do you know who I am? In the West Woods, someone actually dares to use a military mission to scare me." Behind him, The Sunset Governor and the Deputy Speaker were expressionless, but their eyes revealed the same mockery. They thought to themselves, who in Silen's territory doesn't know that this young man's family represents the Federation's army? Who is he? Sulu was startled and turned around to ask Sister Tong. He really did not know the identity of this young man. Sister Tong shook her head. Everyone accompanying them shook their heads, and Lan Xiaolong even shrugged to express his confusion. Only Bai Yulan leaned over to Su Li's ear and whispered a few words. Chapter 388. Bai Yulan had led Team 7 to do some illegal work for the government, and she had also done a lot of private work. They spent most of their time at the edge of the Bermuda sector, so they were no strangers to the big shots in the West Woods who had a wide influence. For people like them who walked on the edge of life and death, if they could not find out who was in charge of this sector, they would be in a lot of trouble. Therefore, on the special highway, Lu Jiao only glanced at the license plate of the white limousine and knew that the troublemaker was from a powerful family. In the past, even if it was a government mission, Bai Yulan would not want to offend these local tyrants in the West Woods. However, it was different now. His boss was Su Lu, so he knew better than anyone else about Su Li's background and temperament. Therefore, he only reminded him in a low voice. After all, the relationship between Su Lu and that family was a little complicated. It was only now that Su Lu knew the identity of the young man in front of him and why he was so strong. This person was called Zhong Ziki, a direct descendant of the West Woods Zhong family. He was ranked second in this generation and was known as Zhong Erlang. Zhong Ziki's father was the eldest brother of Commander Zhong of the West Woods. When he was 3 years old, the eldest son of the Zhong family suddenly passed away. His mother was the only one left, and his only brother was sick all year round. Although Commander Zhong of the West Woods was an untamed tiger in the eyes of the big shots in the Federation, he was very fond of and valued this nephew of his. The current situation of the West Woods Zhong family had always been very delicate. As the heir, Zhong Huiyin had been growing up and studying in the Federation. Most importantly, she was a girl after all. Seeing how much Zhong Laohu doted on this nephew of his, many local forces in the West Woods had been speculating whether the West Woods Zhong family would fall into the hands of this young man in the future. Because of this unspoken speculation, countless branches of the West Woods Zhong family were very close to and respectful of this young man. In this sector, the Zhong family held the economic and military power, and even the Federation government did not care. It was like an independent warlord family. Being highly respected in this kind of family, Zhong Ziqi was naturally successful in every endeavor. In this life, no one dared to go against his will, and he developed a domineering and cold temperament. Thinking of the inscription on the white limousine, Su Lu shook his head. After knowing the identity of the young man in front of him, many of the questions he had after coming to the West Woods were answered. The Zhong family had been stationed in the West Woods for generations. For tens of thousands of years, this family had already controlled most of the military and economy in this region. Whether it was the Changfeng military base or the Venus Hotel, they were nominally managed by the Ministry of Defense, but who knew how many of the officers working there were from the Zhong family? In this sector, there was no secret that the upper echelons of the Zhong family did not know, even if it was a secret mission of the federal military. Therefore, the other party was able to know Jianshe Er's itinerary clearly. In the past few years, Su Lu had been in contact with the 7 great families. These terrifying families did not have much of a sense of mystery in front of him, and he could not feel the thunderous power of the 7 great families like the ordinary citizens of the Federation. Through today's encounter, he once again truly felt the true power of the 7 great families. A random young master chasing after a celebrity could actually get the cooperation of some powerful people in the military base and the West Office to accompany them. They could even get a governor and a deputy speaker to accompany them. The atmosphere in front of the elevator corridor was a little strange. The expensive carpet seemed to have sensed the anger of the West Woods Zhong family after being insulted, and it was trembling in fear. Su Lu lowered his head and listened to the report in his earpiece. He confirmed that Gu Shifeng had already taken control of the Venus Hotel security system and the elevator, and that the members of Team 7 had also finished cleaning up the top floor. He looked up and asked Jian Shui behind him, "You go up first. I'll take care of this." The national girl, who was wrapped in a hooded tracksuit, nodded slightly and walked into the elevator under the personal protection of Magnolia. Several members of Team 7 had serious expressions on their faces as they gripped the strap-on guns at their waists. Although they did not point their guns at the open door, the feeling of being unapproachable was clearly displayed. Zhong Ziki was fanatically obsessed with Jian Shui, otherwise he would not have caused such a big commotion today. However, his obsession was not the love of the national girl as a spectator, but the strong desire of a scion to possess all the beautiful things in the universe. However, from the beginning to the end today, even after knowing his identity, Jian Shui still didn't take off her hat to look him in the eye. She didn't say a word and just walked into the elevator silently, preparing to leave. A strong sense of disappointment and irrepressible anger welled up in his heart. He looked at the elevator and said in a deep voice, "Very good. Miss Jian Shui is tired. Go up and wash up. Change into a dress and rest for a while. The guests will be waiting for you downstairs for 15 minutes. I hope Miss Jian will not disappoint everyone. Don't disappoint me." In his heart, the national girl was his goal. As for her identity as a superstar, it was not in his eyes at all. His gloomy words revealed a strong force that did not allow for negotiation. If Jian Shui did not appear at the reception after 15 minutes, what would happen? The second young master of the Zhong family, with the face of a group of dignitaries, made such a threat at the Golden Star Hotel in the Westwoods. Anyone with the slightest ability to think would be frightened. However, what shocked and angered the people of the Westwoods was that not only did the bodyguards in front of them with guns look normal, even the seemingly delicate idol did not seem to hear him. Her footsteps were normal as usual. Sister Tong, who was the last to enter the elevator, pressed the floor button with a blank face. Through the gradually closing elevator door, she looked at the second young master of the Zhong family, who had a slightly twisted and ugly expression. She thought to herself, "These collateral members of the Zhong family are indeed the rumored bastards of the capital ring. They're so far away from the capital ring that they are too conceited. They did not even know the real identity of the young lady before they dared to come here and make trouble." The celebrities who welcomed Jian Shui at the entrance had already noticed the abnormality of the situation. The hotel's MC hurriedly explained a few words, saying that Miss Jian Shui had gone upstairs to tidy up first. He finally managed to fool them, but most people still smelled a trace of something wrong. "Miss Jian Shui is here to give a military concert. I, Zhong Erlang, dare not be rude." Zhong Ziki looked at Su Lu and said coldly, "But who do you think you are? How dare you stand in my way? I don't care if you work for Blackhawk or Whitewater. In the West Woods, if I don't want you to be a human, you won't be a human." The meaning of this sentence was very clear. Jian Shui was famous in the universe, and this time she was working for the military. No matter how arrogant Zhong Ziki was, whether in terms of influence or other aspects, he couldn't really hurt Jian Shui, and if he was not satisfied later, Jian Shui's subordinates would become the target of his venting. Su Lu lowered his head and covered his ears, listening to the situation report from the intercom system. After confirming that Jian Shui had safely entered the room, he looked up and saw the second young master of the Zhong family and several political bigwigs walking into the hall. He felt that the situation was a bit tricky. Of course, he was not afraid of this playboy, even if he was the favorite nephew of the tiger. He was Jian Shui's security director, but after that night of drinking wine, the relationship between the two had some subtle changes. Jian Shui would definitely not attend this banquet. Would Zhong Ziki dare to go upstairs and snatch her away in public? If this shameless and absurd scene really happened, Su Lu didn't mind teaching these local tyrants a lesson. The reason why he felt it was tricky was because he didn't know how to deal with the second young master of the Zhong family. When it came to fighting and killing, he was not soft-hearted at all. but he had always been close to the Zhong family in the Westwoods. Not to mention Little Watermelon and that lady. Just a few months ago, Commander Zhong firmly asked the president to pardon him, so he owed him a big favor. Was he going to beat up Commander Zhong's favorite nephew until he was paralyzed? Let me make a call. He took off his sunglasses and stood at the door of the hall, listening to the Zhong family's relatives, politicians, and military officers. Their words were full of ridicule and presumptuous ridicule. His mood gradually sank, and he took the military encrypted satellite phone from Lan Xiaolong. Westwoods was too far away from the capital ring, so the phone took a long time to connect. It would take even longer for both sides to synchronize the call. The people who showed up at the welcome reception were all close friends of the Zhong family. The adult men who held important positions in various parties didn't show up, but the ladies and their friends did. After waiting for 15 minutes, the crowd still didn't see the appearance of the national girl. Gradually, their faces turned ugly, and they felt that they were greatly disrespected. In short, in the eyes of these powerful people in the West Woods, Jianshe was just a star. They only showed up out of curiosity and to give face to the second young master of the Zhong family. Who would have thought that the star dared to disrespect them? Second brother, is Jianshe still coming down? Isn't this a bit too extravagant? A lady from a collateral branch of the Zhong family stood up angrily, her eyebrows raised, and said in a sharp voice. Sitting at the front table of the reception, Zhong Ziki looked at his watch with a gloomy face. After confirming that the time had passed, he took a deep breath and said to Su Lu as calmly as possible, "Let her come down and sing 5 songs. After that, you can serve her tea and apologize. I'll forgive her for her rudeness." In Zhong Ziki's opinion, the fact that a mere star had left countless relatives and officers of the Zhong family of the West Woods hanging downstairs and didn't let her serve them tea and apologize was enough to show his love and tolerance. That's right. Our Zhong family has been guarding the border for generations for the Federation. Even if we don't contribute, we still work hard. We've all shed blood on the front lines. How dare she leave us hanging here? Isn't singing for us a service to the army? An officer said in a deep voice. Sulu looked at the reception and thought that even if Jian Shuier had no choice but to agree, he wouldn't allow her to sing in this kind of place. Seeing that Jian Shuiyer's security personnel didn't seem to hear what he said, Zhong Ziki's face became even uglier. The lady from the Zhong family was even more angry and shouted, "Isn't she just a little star? Why are you so smug? Our Zhong family is giving you face, and you don't want it. If you push me too far, I'll call the soldiers upstairs and drag you down." Sulu raised his eyebrows. Just as he was about to fly into a rage, he suddenly heard a thunderous roar coming from the main entrance of the Golden Star Hotel's reception hall. "Drag your mother's ass." Chapter 389. The young lady of the Zhong family was sitting at the table next to the main entrance. She had thought that she could see the distant sea view and bask in the sun from there. In such a good environment for afternoon tea, she would listen to Jian Shuier sing a few songs and take a picture with this national girl with a hint of pride. In the future, she would be able to flaunt it to her friends. Look, even when Jian Shuier comes to the West Woods, she has to curry favor with her first. Unfortunately, her performance was too radical and ungentlemanly. Furthermore, the table she had chosen was a little too close to the main entrance, so the thunderous roar rang directly in her ears. "Drag your mother's ass." The shout exploded at the entrance of the Golden Star Hotel's magnificent hall. It carried with it the aura of metal and stone. It was extremely vulgar, but it was also extremely forceful. It shook the floor-to-ceiling windows slightly, and the empty glass in front of the young lady of the Zhong family shattered on the snow-white tablecloth with a buzzing sound. The violent roar still reverberated as a young officer strode in with 3 subordinates. The few of them walked with the wind like a magnificent army. No one dared to stop them. Countless pairs of eyes were attracted to them. The celebrities at the reception were extremely shocked. What kind of courage did one have to be able to shout so loudly? The young officer was tall and sturdy, and his tight military uniform seemed to contain infinite power. However, The facial features on his face were cold and gloomy, with a trace of youthfulness that had not completely melted away. His face and body formed an extremely clear contrast. That was because he was not yet 18. Even though he had the fierce reputation of being invincible in the army, he was still a youth after all. Most of the guests at the Golden Star Hotel recognized his identity with just a glance. However, they did not understand why this terrifying madman would appear at Jian Shui'er's welcome reception. The young lady of the Zhong family was scared out of her wits by the roar. Her face was pale. Her fragile and proud heart had long shattered along with the glass in front of her. She frowned in fear and looked at Zhong Ziki in front of her. Her voice trembled as she looked for the last bit of support in her spirit. "Second brother, to my ass." Madman Li coldly turned his head to look at this boring woman. His brows furrowed as he scolded. "That brother of yours is really stupid." The delicate young lady of the Zhong family looked at the tall and strong military officer who looked like a savage. Looking at the cold, killing intent on his face, she could no longer bear the mental torture. Her eyes rolled back and she directly fainted, falling into the arms of her boyfriend. Her boyfriend recognized Madman Li's identity, so he didn't dare to stand up and say anything. With a pale face, he hugged her and hurriedly retreated. "Madman Li, you scared my cousin until she fainted. Do you think you're very capable?" Zhong Ziki was annoyed at this time. Suddenly, Madman Li came to disturb his mood. He became even more angry and asked, "What are you doing here?" Li Feng's expression darkened as he walked towards Zhong Ziqi. His strides were extremely large, and in a flash, he was already in front of Zhong Ziqi. Looking down at the Zhong clan's young master, Li Feng gritted his teeth and said coldly, "What do you think I'm doing here?" Zhong Ziki only felt a gust of strong wind blowing in his face, and then Madman Li's body was like a mountain blocking his sight. Feeling the fierce intent, his body couldn't help but stiffen. He forced himself to hold on and said coldly without showing any weakness, "Who knows what you're here for?" Sulu was still waiting for the call to connect. He suddenly found Li Feng at the scene. He couldn't help but be surprised. When he found that Zhong Ziki didn't seem to be afraid of Li Feng, he was even more surprised. It must be known that in the capital ring, the second generation of the 7 families had always avoided Li Feng. "You're also here for Jian Shui'er?" Zhong Ziki suddenly thought that he had understood something. He sneered and said, "Are you going to stand up for her? This world is really strange. As the successor of the war god, you actually want to learn from the adults and fight for a woman?" When Li Feng heard this, his eyebrows gradually rose. A cold smile appeared in his eyes, as if he had heard something very funny. Li Feng, the only grandson of the war god Li Pifu, entered the army at the age of 12 and became the youngest lieutenant colonel in the history of the Federation at the age of 16. No one dared to talk about this inconceivable promotion speed behind his back. On one hand, it was because the Federation respected the Lees of Philadelphia. On the other hand, it was because all his military achievements were earned through real battles. Every change on the epaulets of his military uniform was made by the blood of the Empire's special mecha soldiers. The Ministry of National Defense had done statistics before. In the battle against the Imperial Expeditionary Force and the battle against the Empire's Special Mecha Battalion on the mineral planet near Bermuda in the Night Scorpion Nebula, Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng of the 1st Military Region's Special Mecha Battalion had already killed 117 Empire's ace mecha pilots. Who could compare to such a heroic and valiant military achievement? At this time, in the banquet hall of the Golden Star Hotel, Madman Li and Zhong Ziki were facing off. The relatives of the Zhong family, the politicians, and the officers were very nervous, but no one dared to ask anything. The Zhong family was the local tyrant of the West Woods, but everyone knew the position of this young officer in the hearts of the citizens of the West Woods. After entering the army for almost 6 years, other than the 2 months he spent at the beginning in S2 Mountain Ring, Li Feng had spent most of his military career on the big and small planets in the West Woods. The citizens of the West Woods respected and revered him not only because he was Li Pifu's grandson, but also because he was Madman Li. He was the Madman Li who entered the battlefield at the age of 12 and threw his most precious youth into the bloody and deadly battlefield. He used his blood and sweat to defend the West Woods against the invasion of the Empire. During his years in the West Woods, the Zhong family of the West Woods naturally had to secretly take care of this young genius officer. Li Feng was no stranger to the young people of the Zhong family. Zhong Ziki suppressed the sliver of nervousness in his heart that made him very unhappy and looked coldly at Li Feng. He knew very well that this malignant star in front of him was not really crazy, so he was sure that the other party would not dare to make a move against him. Am I right? Zhong Ziki laughed coldly. He looked at Li Feng, who was close by, and said, "If you like Jian Shuir, then just say it. Let's compete fairly. Don't play this game with me. I've already told you that this little star is mine. Even if I have to throw away my old shoes in the future, I won't throw her to you." Hearing these words, Li Feng smiled, but the smile in his eyes was somewhat cruel. Su Lu, who had been watching this scene from the side, suddenly felt his heart jump. From this smile, he sensed Li Feng's true anger. He didn't know where Madman Li's uncontrollable anger was coming from, but looking at the forcefully composed face of the second young master of the Zhong family, he couldn't help but sigh slightly. This kid and Lin Dohai could be said to be the two most useless prodigals of the 7 great families of the Federation. Li Feng's smile gradually faded. His young features were completely emotionless. He raised his hand and, without hesitation, slapped Zhong Ziki across the face. The slap was loud and clear. The left side of Zhong Ziki's face quickly turned red. He covered his cheek and stared in disbelief at Li Feng in front of him. He didn't know why the other party dared to make a move in front of so many people. Li Feng raised his hand and silently slapped down again. This slap was even louder and heavier than the previous one. Zhong Ziki gave a muffled groan. Blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth as he fell onto the snow-white tablecloth. As he prepared to struggle to get up, Li Feng coldly grabbed his throat and held him down firmly. With this sudden change, the people sitting in the banquet hall of the Venus Hotel could no longer sit still. They couldn't just watch the second young master of the Zhong family get beaten up like this. Although the person who beat him had a great background, this was, after all, the West Woods, the territory of the Zhong family. Even the officers who respected Li Feng hurried over. These officers knew how powerful Madman Li was and nervously reached for the guns at their waists. Of course, they didn't dare to kill the only grandson of the war god on the spot. But if they didn't have guns, they were very worried that Li Feng would slap Zhong Erlang to death. However, Li Feng didn't give them a chance at all. He casually took out the gun at his waist, loaded it with a click, and coldly aimed it between Zhong Ziki's eyebrows. He turned around and said to the nervous officers, "Whoever takes one step forward, I'll shoot him. Lieutenant Colonel Li, don't do anything rash." The governor of Sunset State hid behind the soldiers in fear and waved his hands in fear. He originally wanted to support the second young master of the Zhong family and see the national idol, but he didn't expect to see such a frightening scene. Although he was a big figure in the political circle of the West Woods, he was sandwiched between the Lees of Philadelphia and the Zhong family in the West Woods. He didn't have the courage to do anything. Li Feng ignored this person. He looked coldly at the surrounding officers and said, "Throw away your guns. I'll take on all of you by myself." The officers' faces were very ugly. Looking at the second young master, who was pressed on the table and the cold military pistol pressed between his eyebrows, they didn't dare to take out the guns at their waists, but they also didn't dare to throw away their guns, as Li Feng said. One person fighting all of you alone. How arrogant was that? These Silin officers knew very well that if Madman Li were to challenge them all on his own, they would still be the ones to be beaten until they vomited blood and fainted in the end. They would still be the ones to be beaten until they vomited blood and fainted. At this time, Zhong Ziki showed a trace of the Zhong family in the West Woods. Although he was arrogant and unscrupulous, he had learned a trace of his uncle's tiger aura. He was awkwardly leaning on the table, and his eyebrows were in pain because of Li Feng's gun, but he still arrogantly roared, "Shoot if you have the guts. I'll see how you explain to your grandfather." Chapter 390. Just like Su Li's previous doubts, the sons of the aristocratic families and the descendants of the politicians in the capital ring, no matter if they were in Lin Yuan or somewhere else, would avoid Madman Li, who had just returned from the front line. This was because Li Feng exuded the aura of an iron-blooded and barbaric soldier. He never cared about rules and only cared about his fists. However, the West Woods was different from the capital ring. This was the front line of the war between the Federation and the Empire. It was customary to compare the size of one's fists here. The Zhong family of the West Woods was also fundamentally different from the other aristocratic families. The Zhong family had been in charge of the 4th military region of the Federation for generations. Most of the men in the family had been on the battlefield. Although Zhong Ziki never had the opportunity, he had also studied at the West Woods Military Academy. He was not like the other aristocratic families who would be scared and run away like a little white rabbit when they saw Madman Li with his tough military style. At this time, Zhong Ziki had a cold gun barrel pressed against his forehead, but he still dared to roar at Madman Li. Other than the legacy of the Zhong family of the West Woods, more importantly, the entire Zhong family of the West Woods knew very well how much they had sacrificed to guard the border for the Federation. For decades, the soldiers of the West Woods shed blood and shed blood. They fought hard against the Imperial Expeditionary Force again and again to bring peace and prosperity to the core of the Federation's capital ring. It could be said that they had worked hard and contributed a lot. The most important thing was that the Zhong family had guns in their hands, so they were confident. Li Feng was the only grandson of the war god, but if he really dared to shoot the favorite nephew of the Zhong family's tiger, he would have to pay with his life in this kind of atmosphere. Even the old man who was on the shore of Lake Feiqing and whose heart was in the Federation universe might personally hand Li Feng to the West Woods people in order to appease the West Woods people. Why do you want to shoot me? Zhong Ziki had already felt Madman Li's undisguised killing intent. Suppressing his emotions, he grabbed the gun and roared, "If you can't give me a reason today, I'll still win this case, even if we go to Philadelphia." In the eyes of everyone present, the Zhong family of West Woods was hosting a reception to welcome the nation's young ladies for the second young master. Although it was a little overbearing, actually, I didn't think it was overbearing. What did this have to do with Li Feng? If it was really as everyone had guessed, Madman Li was jealous of the Zhong family's young lady. He had scared the young lady of the Zhong family with a shout and slapped Zhong Erlang twice. Now, he actually dared to pull out a gun and threaten to kill. This was too unreasonable. Li Feng frowned, looked at Zhong Ziki and asked, "You want a reason?" Zhong Ziki laid on the table with his head up, looked at the ceiling, and snorted. At this time, Su Lu finally got through the phone. He whispered a few words and narrowed his eyes to look at the conflict in the banquet hall. He was worried that Madman Li wouldn't be able to deal with it, so he was ready to go over there to solve the problem. However, he found that Sister Tong had unknowingly walked over to him. "It's very lively," Sister Tong said helplessly. "Miss asked me to come down and see the situation, but it seems that I don't need to." Li Feng held the gun with his wrist and pressed it down again, using the muzzle to press Zhong Ziki's head hard on the table. When he was about to say his reason, he saw Sister Tong from the corner of his eye. He saw Sister Tong slightly frown and shake her head. The tiger of the Zhong family had always taken care of Li Feng, so he couldn't really kill Zhong Ziki. However, at this time, when he was about to say his reason, Sister Tong shook her head to express someone's attitude. Li Feng frowned and suddenly thought of the words he heard outside the hotel. "If I say my reason, what will you say?" He looked down at Zhong Ziki's red face and said disdainfully, "If you say your reason, you'll cripple me." Zhong Ziki struggled for a moment and felt a sharp pain between his eyebrows. He said fiercely, "Okay," Li Feng said expressionlessly. "Just now I was outside the door and heard you ask someone to pour tea for you and apologize." The people in the banquet hall of the Venus Hotel watched this scene nervously. No one called the police, nor did they go to the military police because they knew that no one could or dared to solve the problem at this time. In the entire West Woods, the only ones who had the guts to solve this problem were the couple. The man was supervising the battle at the front lines, and the woman was a mother in the capital ring. Zhong Ziki was stunned for a moment before he sneered and scolded. Are you crazy? Can't you find a better reason to be angry? I asked that bodyguard to pour tea for me and apologize. Is that too much? This kind of small fry is just a dog. If you say that it's your reason to stand up for him, you're insulting everyone's intelligence. Although Li Feng was crazy, he was actually very smart. Otherwise, he would not have become the top genius pilot in the Federation. He originally thought that this reason was not enough, but when he heard Zhong Ziki call him a dog, his eyes could not help but light up. Very good. Scold him a little more, Li Feng said with a smile, but then his smile sank. He lowered his head and whispered in Zhong Ziki's ear, You're a country bumpkin who has never been to the capital ring. Before you do anything, you don't even know who this bodyguard of yours is. After saying this, he coldly put away his pistol. Zhong Ziki straightened his body with difficulty. He held his red and swollen forehead and looked at him angrily. He asked, Reason? If you want reason, I'll give you reason. Li Feng pointed at Su Lu, who was walking towards him, and said very seriously, You asked him to pour tea for you and apologize. You said he's a dog. His name is Su Lu. My old man asked me to call him uncle. What do you think is his relationship with my family? Li Feng looked at Zhong Ziki expressionlessly and said, If my uncle is a dog, then I'm a dog too. My dad is a dog too. You mean to say that you think my old man is an old dog too? When this was said, the crowd was in an uproar. Westwoods was far away from the capital ring. There were many things that happened in the upper echelons of the Federation. They knew much later, and many details were not clear. However, in the 68th year of the constitutional calendar, the youngest lieutenant colonel after Li Feng appeared in the Federal Army. This kind of sensational news was naturally known to many people. They did not care about the MX mech or the fight between the Iron 7th Division. The people of Westwoods were most concerned about the rumor that was spreading like wildfire. There had always been a rumor within the military that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu could be the illegitimate son of war god Li Pifu. Today, Li Feng had said in front of everyone that the head of security was Su Lu and admitted that the old war god had asked Li Feng to call him uncle. Did this not prove the rumor on a certain level? Countless eyes looked at Su Lu. Was this shocking rumor going to come to light today? However, immediately after that, everyone looked at Zhong Ziki because they found that the second young master's expression was unusually ugly. Li Feng looked at him and asked coldly, Is hitting you a good enough reason? After a long time, Zhong Ziki recovered from his shock. He was furious. How could he have thought that he would be connected to the Lees of Philadelphia just because he casually scolded a head of security? In all honesty, even if he was given 10,000 guts, he would not dare to say that war godly Pifu was an old dog in front of so many people. He did not hesitate. He glared fiercely at Su Lu, spat, and said, Today, I've been tricked by you uncle and nephew. Madman Li, if you really want to cripple me, you can do it. Li Feng's previous rage had nothing to do with Su Lu. He had not yet vented the anger in his heart. Thinking of the words, used shoes celebrity, his smile became colder. He said, How would I dare to cripple you? It shouldn't be a problem to make you unconscious for a few days. After saying this, the young lieutenant colonel silently flipped his iron elbow. It whistled up and hit Zhong Ziki's forehead. With a muffled sound, blood splattered. The second young master of the Zhong family did not even make a sound before he fell to the ground unconscious. With a flip of the iron elbow, the scene was once again in chaos. The older female members of the Zhong family screamed and cursed Madman Li from afar. They knew that Madman Li was famous for not hitting women. Although they were still afraid, they would not stop cursing. The officers of the West Woods numbly carried the unconscious Zhong Ziki away. After a quick check, they knew that the second young master was fine. They thought to themselves that they had seen something new today. The second young master was actually bullied to the point that he could only take a beating, and they could actually see the illegitimate son of the war god with their own eyes. The scene was chaotic. Sula narrowed his eyes at the scene and could not help but feel that Madman Li was indeed a fierce child. The matter had clearly been resolved, but he still had to hit someone with his elbow. However, he was puzzled. Madman Li would never stand up for him. So where did his anger come from? He walked to the top of the stage, politely took the microphone from the dumbfounded MC, and then attached his phone to the microphone. On the phone, Madame Zhong's indifferent and dignified voice was played out by the speaker, and immediately the chaos in the hall was cleared up. I've heard everything. From today onwards, second young master does not need to return to Jingwei. He will be grounded in the old house until the commander returns from the front line. Madame Zhong was on the capital ring, thousands of kilometers away. She said to her family members in a deep voice, "Don't you all have too much time on your hands? How dare you mess around with him? Get the hell back." Su Lu hung up the phone, nodded to the dumbfounded Zhong family members in the audience, and then stepped off the stage. Su Lu finally saw the power of the gentle Madame Zhong in the family. It was just a phone call, and the proud and angry Zhong family members in the banquet hall were suddenly frightened. They did not dare to cause any more trouble and scattered like birds and animals. Finally, the Venus Hotel was quiet again. Don't think too highly of yourself. I'm standing up for you. Li Feng looked straight ahead and said coldly, I'm just looking for a reason to vent my anger. Yes, but you haven't called me uncle yet, Su Lu said seriously. Sister Tong smiled on the side. Li Feng's face was a little ugly, but he did not want to say anything else. When they reached the top floor, Sister Tong naturally invited Li Feng into the suite where Jian Shi was. Su Lu frowned slightly. He did not want to follow in, but he could not suppress the doubt in his heart and follow behind. Li Feng looked at the purple-haired girl by the window and strode forward. With a clap, he stood at attention and performed a proper military salute. He loudly said, Commander Li Feng. Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng greets Annie. Chapter 391. Jian Shi sat quietly on the balcony by the window. She wore a blue and white striped cargo pants and a loose red shirt. She looked as comfortable as a girl next door. The suite was very large. The darkwood balcony was warm and smooth. It might be very comfortable to sit on it, and it should also be very comfortable to read under the sun. Therefore, when the door was pushed open, she didn't even turn around. Her purple hair gently fell down from her forehead as she swept her eyes over the pages of the book. The first time Su Lu saw her up close was in the ward of the 1st Military Region's General Hospital. That day, the sun was also shining through the window. Jian Shuier was wearing a plain dress. She was as beautiful as a young girl who had walked out of an oil painting. Now that he saw the girl under the sun again, he should have felt some emotions, but all the emotions in his heart had long been attracted by Madman Li's words. Other than shock, he couldn't feel anything else. The popular national girl Jian Shuier was Li Feng's aunt. She was a member of the Lees of Philadelphia. Su Lu stood at the door and stared blankly at the girl under the sun by the window. For a moment, it was unknown how many complex emotions and speculations surged into his mind, destroying his extraordinarily thick nerves and the calm calculation ability unique to engineers. When Sister Tong left the room, she glanced at this young officer in surprise. She was fooled by Su Li's calm appearance, believing that Su Lu already knew Jian Shuier's identity. She couldn't help but sigh at his ability to disguise himself on the warship. She only knew that the old war god valued Su Lu, but she didn't know that Su Lu had an intimate relationship with another person in the Lees of Philadelphia. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and followed Sister Tong out of the room. He then gently closed the door, put on his sunglasses again, and stood guard outside the door. However, when he gripped the door lock and put on his sunglasses, his usually steady fingers actually trembled slightly. The national girl sat on the windowsill, her long eyelashes glowing with a charming luster under the sun. She did not move for a long time, looking as if she had fallen asleep. However, when Li Feng stood behind her for a few seconds, the girl reached into the snack belt beside her and took out a piece of egg yolk pastry. She brought it to her mouth and chewed it. She frowned slightly and said, I'm not an officer. Don't do this in front of me. Isn't that the family's rule? You flew out when you were young, but Grandpa liked you so much. I don't have your charisma. Li Feng took off his military cap and sat on the chair in a well-behaved manner. He looked at the girl by the window and nervously explained, "When my family told me that you were coming, I was carrying out a mission. I just got off the front line the day before yesterday, so I came a little late." There were not many people in the family by Lake Feiqing. Jian Shui'er left when she was less than 12 years old and began her own independent life in the capital. However, whenever there was a chance, the three generations of the Li family would always find an opportunity to get together, especially when Li Feng came back from the front line. What made Li Feng sad was that although the girl by the window was only a year and a few months older than him, she was his elder. When he saw her, he had to respectfully call her aunt. In the family by the lake, the person who was doted on the most by the old man was not him, the brave young man, but this purple-haired girl. Li Feng, who was not afraid of anything, would always feel uneasy in front of his little aunt, Jianxia, due to the habit he had developed since he was young. Recently, the military has made a big move. I have to go back to the front line at night, so I will leave in a while. Li Feng said, "Aunt, I didn't handle today's matter well. Please don't blame me." Jian Shui'er put down the book and turned her head to glare at him unhappily. She handed over the bag of synthetic egg yolk and said, "You only know how to fight and kill every day. This kind of thing can be solved by directly calling Mrs. Zhong. Even if you don't have the face to do so, it's fine to let the old man do it." It was strange that this girl, who had just celebrated her 19th birthday, used the tone of an elder to reprimand Madman Li, who killed people like flies. Not only did it not feel absurd, but it also seemed very natural and friendly. Didn't you hear the second master's unpleasant words? Fortunately, you're the one who came to hold a concert for the military. The person he fanatically worships is you. If it were any other star, wouldn't they have fallen into his evil hands? Li Feng sneered and said, "He didn't have time to do anything. Otherwise, I think Zhong Laohu would have to put righteousness before family." The relationship between the Lees of Philadelphia and the national girl idol was a secret. The big shots in the Federation, who vaguely knew about this, only knew that the two were related by blood, but they didn't understand the real purpose of the military god forcibly blocking this relationship. Li Xiuzhu tried his best to pursue Jian Shui'er. On the one hand, it was because of love, but at the beginning of the blind date, who could say that the old man wearing the small round hat was not trying to establish a close relationship with the most powerful family in the military? Lady Tai knew that after the blind date arranged by Li Jie-du, she went to Philadelphia to meet the old man. She directly expressed her dissatisfaction with the Li family's attempt, because she was the only one who knew the purpose of the Lees of Philadelphia blocking this relationship. "You are alone in the front line. Be careful." Jian Shui'er looked at Li Feng, who lowered his head and ate the egg yolk cake, and said with concern, "You are the only grandson of the old Li family. In these years, you have been a thorn in their side. The people of the empire are cunning and ruthless. In order to kill you, they will do anything. Of course, I know your ability, but the problem is that don't be too brave. Don't think about how many times you have been injured in these years." "I'm fine." In front of Jian Shui'er, Li Feng was more like a big boy who had not completely left his adolescence. While eating the egg yolk cake, he said vaguely, "Andy, the place where you held the concert this time is really dangerous. The problem is that I am on a mission, so I can't stay with you." "It's okay. The old man specially arranged someone." Jian Shui'er thought of Su Lu, who was standing at the door before, and cutely tilted her head and fell into deep thought. She wondered how the small-eyed boy's mood would change after knowing her true background. There is no problem with the small-eyed man's ability. Li Feng wiped the crumbs from his mouth. After thinking for a moment, he seriously gave Su Lu a fair evaluation. "But as I said before, the military has been making a big move recently. I always feel that it is not appropriate for Annie to come to the West Woods at this time." The federal military had strict discipline. Although facing his auntie, Li Feng still could not explain in more detail. Jian Shui'er smiled slightly and handed him a wet tissue, but she did not care. Li Feng thought of the federal military's recent military deployment and war preparations that had not stopped recently. Looking at his auntie's sweet and warm smile, a shadow flashed in his heart. "Is the egg yolk cake delicious?" On the observation deck on the top floor of the Venus Hotel, Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the blue sky and white sand and asked Madmanly next to him. Then he took out the 37 brand cigarettes, lit one, and handed one over. I don't smoke. Li Feng rejected the cigarette that represented some kind of peace. After a slight pause, he said with a trace of emotion, I don't like to eat egg yolk cake either, but Annie likes to eat it with red wine. When I was young, I snatched it once, and she always thought that I liked to eat it. Now, every time she sees me, she wants to give me a few. I have to eat it even if I don't want to. I don't dare to disobey her. For some reason, Sulu was only 3 years older than Li Feng, but he always felt that his mentality was much older than the other parties. No one in the Federation would treat this Lieutenant Colonel Madman Li, whose hands were stained with the blood of the Empire's invaders, as a youth. He subconsciously felt this way. At this moment, when he heard the trace of emotion in the other party's words, he felt a little uncomfortable. He took a deep breath of a cigarette, and then he exhaled the light green smoke into the dark blue westwood sky. He narrowed his eyes and said, It seems that no one has ever known that Jian Shui'er is Director Li's younger sister. Those who know about this matter are not humans. Li Feng mocked the big shots in the capital ring. His father, Major General Li Jiedu, was now the vice director of the 1st Military Academy. Then, a strange expression flashed across his face. He stared at Su Lu and asked, Did no one tell you? Tell me what? Su Li's heart shrank slightly. Auntie is granduncle's biological daughter. Li Feng stared at him with furrowed brows and said in disbelief, Then Auntie doesn't know that you are granduncle's student? The second spring thunder rang in Su Li's heart. Although he already had an extremely strong premonition when he heard about Jian Shui'er's identity, he was still a little confused and helpless by this news. He numbly shook his head. What a mess. Li Feng suddenly felt some sympathy for Su Lu. Those old guys threw you into a pile and actually asked you to play a guessing game. I really don't know what they are thinking. The answer to the riddle is finally revealed. Su Lu lowered his head and slowly put out the cigarette on the railing. Li Feng was silent for a moment, and then he shook his head and said, I just feel very regretful. If this mess continues, it will become more and more impossible for me to kill you. That's true. No matter what, I am your uncle now. Su Lu put the extinguished cigarette back into his palm and answered softly. Li Feng turned and left. The west wood's sun shone on the young lieutenant colonel's face, but it illuminated a bit of anger and embarrassment. The military vehicle drove toward Longwind Base. 3 subordinate officers in the vehicle followed him around all year round, so they were not afraid of him. They looked at his face and asked, Lieutenant Colonel, what is troubling you so much? If I have to call that guy uncle, I will be full of complaints. Li Feng frowned and said coldly, When I think that I may have to call him uncle in the future, I can't wait to kill him right away. Sula needed time to understand the shocking secret he learned today, so he directly went back to his room, took a hot shower, and then sat on the bed in a daze. Jian Shui'er, the national girl who was loved and respected by the people of the Federation, was the relative of the Federation's military god, Li Pifu. If this news was published by someone, it would definitely be listed as one of the top 10 news of the year, or even the most shocking news. For Sulu, this truth really shocked him, and the fact that Jian Shui'er was his uncle's biological daughter left in the world made him feel even more confused and helpless. There was a light knock on the door. He wiped his wet hair with a towel, forced himself to calm down, and said, Please come in. Chapter 392. While the banquet hall was in chaos, Team 7 had begun an internal investigation in secret. It was not hard to imagine that the Zhong family in the West Woods knew all their whereabouts. However, the arrangement of Jian Shui'er sitting in the black car was only known to the people in the team. Even this was clearly known by Zhong Ziqi's subordinates, so there was obviously a mole. In less than 2 hours, Team 7 found a suspect, the assistant director of the concert's technical team. This assistant director had come into contact with the Zhong family at the Silin Sector's Interstellar Space Inspection Station. The other party had bribed many details of the team with a large sum of money. Vi Magnolia used some unknown method to make this assistant director spit out all the gray income and was then thrown on a long-range space ship back to the capital ring. Back in S1, what awaited him was a complete loss of reputation. As for the relevant officer in the Changfeng military base who leaked the secrets, neither Su Lu nor Team 7 could do anything about it, so Bai Magnolia could only send the information to the Department of Defense. The legal department will definitely come up with an opinion, but the Department of Defense's voice has never been very loud in the Westwoods, Bai Magnolia said softly. Sula didn't care what kind of methods the men in Group 7 used to destroy the assistant director's life, wealth, and reputation. Since the assistant director had done something wrong, he must pay the price. He just thought about the people from the Zhong family he met today and vaguely understood why the Federation government had been trying to suppress the Zhong family in the Westwoods. A big family with military power far on the front line was indeed too heavy for the Federation. We will depart to 5,460 in 3 days. Although the military is in charge of the defense of the concert, everyone needs to be alert. That is the real front line. I heard that there are 70,000 Imperial Expeditionary Force hidden in the mountains of the Northern Hemisphere. Su Li's heart was also heavy. He put the wet towel beside him and looked at Bai Magnolia. We can't let Miss Jian Shui'er get hurt. Bai Magnolia did not know about Jian Shui'er's secret identity, but she sensed the seriousness in Su Li's voice. She nodded and said softly, "The president of the Golden Star Hotel, who is also the director of the Department of Defense's office in the Westwoods, Major General Chiaoda, wants to see you." Sulu was slightly stunned. He looked at Bai Magnolia and immediately reacted. Mad Manly had caused such a ruckus at the cocktail party, and everyone in Silin knew of his origins. Naturally, someone like the director of the Department of National Defense's office in Silin would need to explain to him what had happened earlier. Whether the rumor was true or not, at least the federal military knew that Su Lu was chosen by the war god. "I'm not used to dealing with this kind of thing. My current identity is just a bodyguard." Su Lu shook his head and said, "Don't worry about the things in the Sunset State. We won't be staying in the West Woods for long. You and Lan Xiaolong should quickly come up with a plan for the concert security. The original plan, I think it needs to be revised. I have a feeling that this concert is not that simple." After Bai Magnolia left, he simply cleaned up the room and cautiously declined an invitation to have dinner with one of the generals of the 4 military regions. When he thought about how he had become a popular person in the eyes of so many people and how these high-ranking generals had to deliberately win him over or get close to him, he could not help but feel a little strange. Just as he was about to continue to daze in the room and digest the shock of Jian Shui'er's identity, he heard a report in his earpiece. The national girl suddenly wanted to go swimming. Sulu was slightly stunned. He looked at the bright sunlight outside the window, changed into a thin black summer dress, and walked out of the room. No matter how he felt at the moment, he had to stay by Jian Shui'er's side and protect her safety. In that sunny afternoon in the hospital, he had once said to himself that he owed Jian Shui'er a life, so he was willing to take Group 7 and cross the Milky Way to the West Woods to protect her personal safety. And from this moment on, he would no longer think about how many lives he owed her. Instead, he would use all his strength to make sure that the purple hair girl would not suffer any harm, because she was the uncle's only child. Standing in the quiet corridor and stepping on the soft carpet, he looked at the dark wooden door through the light of the hotel's elegant wall lamps. His eyes narrowed. At this time, should he knock on the door and enter, tell the young girl about the history of the Donglin Revolution, and then cry in her arms and play the show of recognizing her as his relative? Or should he pretend that he didn't know anything and wait to see what tricks the old man was playing? The door was pushed open, and Jian Shi, wearing a white bathrobe and accompanied by Sister Tong, walked out. She looked at Su Lu with a sweet smile and said, "Sorry to trouble you." The girl wore a dark, wide-brimmed hat that hid all her purple hair. Large sunglasses covered 2/3 of her delicate face, revealing only the tip of her nose and red and lovely lips. Her bare feet shyly peeked out from under the bathrobe, like a delicate and lovely white flower that had just bloomed. Su Lu was half a head taller than her, so he naturally lowered his eyes. Through the sunglasses, he saw a touch of white on the girl's bathrobe neck. He suppressed the confusion in his heart and answered softly, "I'm not afraid of trouble." The main administrative planet of the Westwoods region was usually called the Westwoods planet. The development of this planet was tens of thousands of years later than the capital ring. From the beginning, it used clean energy. People extracted hydrogen energy from seawater and used geothermal energy efficiently. Coupled with the huge network of wind generators on the northern plateau, it completely met the basic energy needs of the Westwoods. It did not experience heavy energy pollution in the early days and did not pay a terrible environmental price like the crystal mine development in the Donglin region. Therefore, the Westwoods planet had the most famous blue sea and blue sky in the entire Federation. The curved silver beach in the Sunset State was the most beautiful and most pleasant place among the blue sea and blue sky. As the property of the Federation's military, the Venus Hotel undoubtedly occupied the best spot in Silver Beach. Furthermore, an isolated area was set up for the hotel's most distinguished guests. In the past, only officers with at least the rank of Major General could enjoy the white sea and white sand that even the tycoons could not monopolize. However, the National Idol's appeal in the Federation was unparalleled. This time, her comeback concert was held in front of the Westwoods' frontline soldiers, so naturally, the treatment was different. Because of the previous incident, everyone in the Department of Defense in the Westwoods knew who the National Idol security director was. Naturally, they opened the door wide and vacated the beautiful Bay Beach, forbidding anyone from entering. Countless waves of blue water of different shades moistened the eyes. In the distance, there were white seagulls flying up and down between a few light clouds, stirring up a few lively waves on the calm sea. Jian Shui'er did not throw away her white bathrobe and rush to the calm sea with a bell-like laughter like she was in the movies. She just sat quietly on the beach chair, hugging her arms tightly as if she was afraid of the cold, and slightly narrowed her eyes with a hint of sultry beauty. Sister Tong stood in the shadow of a palm tree in the distance, and Su Lu stood in the shadow of an umbrella. He wore sunglasses and a black summer suit, looking ahead with an expressionless face. But because of this situation, he remembered a certain conversation with Tai Ziyuan 2 years ago at the beach. You can't pretend to be a bodyguard just by wearing sunglasses and standing there expressionlessly with your hands behind your back. Jian Shui'er turned to look at him and couldn't help but laugh out loud. I also wear sunglasses. I don't think I'm a bodyguard. Su Li's cheeks were slightly hot, not because he was being teased by the girl, but because he didn't expect Jian Shui'er's laughter to be so clear and bright. She didn't have the restraint of a superstar at all. What's more, the black summer suit you're wearing is Givenchy's new design. To be precise, it's something that the master left for next year. How much does it cost? Jian Shui'er looked at him with a smile. Even the most powerful bodyguard in the Federation can't afford such expensive clothes. So, no matter how you hide it, your small eyes, expensive clothes, and silly smile will all betray your true identity. Most of Su Li's current clothes were bought by Tai Ziyuan and Li Xiaotong, who pitted him for not knowing about the world and sent him to his apartment. Some of them were bought by Secretary Bai, who didn't know about the material of these brands. Naturally, he didn't know that this seemingly ordinary black summer dress was expensive enough to expose his identity. I heard that you don't know much about so-called fashion, Su Lu said with a smile. My real name is Jian Muzi. Without any warning, Jian Shui'er took off her large sunglasses. The sea breeze caressed the girl's beautiful face and her delicate cheeks. She looked at Su Lu and said with a smile, I didn't want to lie to you that night. My parents are indeed long dead. I don't even know who they are. Muzi is Li. I was brought back to the Li family by the old man, so I'm called Jian Muzi. She smiled and added, The old man is the old man you were talking about. Su Lu was silent. The sunglasses reflected the clear blue sky and white sand. Jian Shui'er narrowed her eyes. She didn't know what he was thinking. she said softly. I hope my story won't shock you too much. Sulu slowly took off his sunglasses and looked at the girl in the chair with a smile. He vaguely understood why, when he rarely saw her, other than the joy of seeing his dream idol, he also felt a sense of familial closeness. It was because of the blood flowing in her body. I also want to tell you a story. I hope you won't be too surprised. What story? Jian Shui'er asked curiously. A story about your father. Jian Shui'er gradually opened her eyes. Her long eyelashes fluttered softly in the sea breeze. Your father was my teacher. I grew up with him in Donglin. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed. His thoughts returned to a long time ago. That decaying planet, that shabby repair shop, that mine full of stray cats, those raging bulls, that uncle with a backpack full of repair tools. A few important words. I'm sorry to inform everyone that I only have 2 chapters left today. Being busy during the day is one thing, and I know my own problems. The problem is that I'm not in the right state of mind. This can be forced out, and it's not difficult to write another chapter now. Posting it early in the morning will make it hit the weekly rankings, but I really can't write anymore. I was actually quite satisfied with the quality of my previous chapters, but today's 2 chapters are very wrong. There's a problem with the quality, especially this chapter. I'm cursing myself as I'm editing it. The words are still okay, but the narration is really bad. It's really bad. In Guadi Gang's words, it's really annoying. I've been writing too much for the past few days. Apart from Christmas Eve, I've always been writing at 3. Silly Cat is unprecedentedly diligent. I'm not complaining about being tired, nor am I complaining, because I'm really not tired at all. It's not hard at all. I've already thought of the plot. It's just that I'm a little tired of writing. It's like eating too much fat every day and wanting to vomit. I'm not pregnant, so don't worry. Last time, I promised to write it 3 chapters every 8 days. Now, I've only completed 6. Before the end of this month, I'll definitely write at 3 chapters every 8 days. Tonight, I'll clean up the outline and plot a little more. Then, I'll clear my head and chase away all the greasy words. I'll grab some clarity from the air and stuff it back in. Tomorrow, I'll continue to be invincible. Ugly girl invincible? Tut tut. See you all tomorrow. Air, Lard has no intention of writing at 3 chapters every night. I'm calling everyone to vote for me after midnight, because the rankings will be updated on Monday. Again, I've only just realized that last week's rankings were really good. Also, I'm in a good mood to get these votes because they're free. Brothers and sisters, please bear with me and support me. I sincerely thank you. Chapter 393. Sulu originally wanted to say that he grew up with the uncle, but who would have thought that it would turn into such an awkward narrative? On the warship, he had once told his story to Jian Shui'er while drinking red wine. However, he wasn't someone who was good at telling stories, especially since the story he was going to tell today was related to Jian Shui'er. He was deeply immersed in his own life and memories, so when he looked at the shocked, beautiful girl in the chair and saw her tightly clutching the edge of her bathrobe, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. How did the story begin? He could guess why the uncle abandoned his own flesh and blood, but he did not know whether he should tell her or not. Should he say that when they were in Donglin, the uncle would go to the sanatorium every week to visit prostitutes while he was in charge of paying the bill? Or should he say that when the uncle was in a good mood, he would take him to sit in the repair shop on Xianglan Avenue and admire the white and tender thighs of the policewomen in short skirts and boots through the floor-to-ceiling glass window? Let's start with the heavy repair tools behind the uncle's butt. Those seemingly simple tools, such as the star-shaped screwdriver, were like a string of proud wind chimes, constantly colliding with the uncle's sturdy and proud, but producing a proud and crisp sound on the other side of the deserted mine pit and the electronic wall. Telling the uncle's story to Jian Shui'er was tantamount to letting Sulu reminisce about his life in Donglin. He spoke more and more naturally and smoothly, and his slightly squinted eyes grew brighter under the sunlight. They were not tears, but reminiscence and sadness. As he reminisced and narrated, Sulu understood many things. Why would the indifferent uncle Feng Yu, who appeared to have experienced many vicissitudes of life, be so fanatical and obsessed with a national girl like the most ordinary people? Why would he hold a bottle of red wine every day and stare at the Federation's Channel 23 just to watch that TV series? That was because he had left his own flesh and blood and could not let his daughter grow up by his side. He could only silently pay attention to the little girl on the Capitol ring in this way, using it as a form of comfort and spiritual sustenance. This kind of spiritual sustenance was extremely important to Feng Yu, so much so that after the Hushy Region Radio Management Committee temporarily stopped broadcasting Channel 23, the purple-haired girl's face disappeared from the TV screen. The uncle angrily ordered him to incite the orphan gang on Clock Tower Street to demonstrate. As one of the most wanted criminals in the Federation, this kind of action was obviously not in line with his cautious style as he moved through the glory of the charter, but it was in line with the anger of a father. The sea breeze blew gently, but it could not blow away the dry heat and stifling atmosphere under the parasol. During Su Li's narration, Jian Shui listened in silence. After the initial shock, her expression returned to that of a young girl's tranquility, as if the person Su Lu was describing had nothing to do with her. She didn't even ask any questions. "Uncle, he had his own reasons for leaving you." Su Lu rubbed the frame of his sunglasses. He felt a little sad because of the girl's unusual silence. After some thought, he said in a low voice, "He has always been wanted by the Federation, so he couldn't have been with you as you grew up. When you were in Eastwood, he was actually always silently watching you. Although he never said it, I know he must have missed you a lot." Jian Shui sat in the chair without moving. She had maintained this posture for too long, causing the back of her neck to feel a little numb. She suddenly took a deep breath and asked with a sweet smile, "Last time you told me that you escaped from Eastwood, you also said that you had an uncle who was killed and that you couldn't take revenge. The uncle you were talking about, is it the one you were talking about right now?" The storytelling took a long time, and it was already dusk. The shadows under the parasol swayed slightly. The surface of the sea was quiet. Sula dared to look at the smile on her face and the cute dimples on her cheeks. He forced himself to raise his head and look into the distance with some confusion. However, his eyes were narrowed by the scorching sun that was gradually moving toward the horizon. A girl who had lost her parents when she was young suddenly found out that in the past years, her father had lived on some declining planet in the universe. However, before she had the chance to be pleasantly surprised, she was forced to accept the fact that the father she had never met had long since died. What a cruel plot this was. After a long silence, he opened his mouth with some difficulty and admitted, "Yes." Jian Shui didn't cry. She only furrowed her brows in an extremely pretty manner. She propped up her chin and looked at the sea that was rippling with thousands of golden threads. She was incomparably peaceful, and there was even a hint of a warm smile on her face. It was as if she was thinking about some profound, but also very interesting philosophical question. After a long time, she opened her eyes wide, blinked her eyelashes, and asked curiously, "Why is he wanted by the Federation?" "The old man never told me these things. He only said that he had died a long time ago." Sulu replied, "Your father is the #1 target of the Bureau of Proclamation. He didn't know how much makeup had been applied on the history of the past, or how many black clothes had been worn, but he didn't want to use things that he didn't know to explain anything for the uncle." This was the effect of the same pride in the different temperaments of the master and disciple in the mind. A very simple explanation was better than thousands of explanations. The glory of the charter had never made a mistake. Jiansha hugged her shoulders tightly, somewhat at a loss, and then smiled slightly with unknown emotions. A moment later, she turned around and pursed her lips proudly. She raised her head to look at Su Lu behind the chair, who was using his distant eyes to hide the emotions in his heart. She asked, "It seems that the old man wanted you to come with me to the West Woods because he wanted to tell me this through your mouth." The Federation's god of war, Li Pifu, was the most dazzling star in the universe. He was revered and worshipped by countless people. Even the royal family of the empire, who wanted nothing more than to eat his flesh alive, would always have a trace of reverence when they mentioned him, in addition to hatred. There were probably only two people in the universe who dared to call him Old Man. The time when Su Lu had blurted it out in Qingqing prison didn't count. The only people who dared to call Li Pifu that way happened to be a father and daughter pair. Things like blood ties were really wonderful. However, when Fengyu mentioned his biological brother, he used the three words, old man, to express some kind of disdain and ridicule. Jian Shen called him that, but it represented Li Pifu's unparalleled love for her and her affection for this old man. That might be one of the reasons, Su Lu replied. Jian Shui didn't ask any more questions. She turned her head and squinted her eyes to look at the sea. Her beautiful and petite face was filled with faint loneliness and sorrow. She was the most adorable and well-liked national girl, but this didn't mean that she wasn't intelligent. In fact, the people from the Li family were either demons or monsters, or elves that had fallen into the human world. Therefore, she didn't angrily ask the Li family why they watched as her father was wandered, and died. She also didn't painfully grab Su Li's clothes and ask him to explain that her father wasn't a bad person, but rather someone who had been framed. This kind of plot was a drama, not real life. Thank you for telling me everything about my father. From your story, I can roughly imagine what kind of person he was. Jian Shen stood up from the chair and gently untied the belt of her bathrobe. She said softly, "In my imagination, his life must be a mess. You were so young back then, and you had to take care of him. I really can't imagine." Jian Shui took off her bathrobe, turned her head, and looked at Su Lu with an extremely serious expression. She was wearing a dark blue swimsuit. It was a conservative one-piece swimsuit, but the close-fitting material exposed the girl's youthful and attractive curves. "I'll give you a hug." She walked forward and gently hugged Su Lu. Her tone was playful, but extremely sincere. "Thank you for taking care of him for me in Donglin for so many years." Feeling the warmth from his arms and smelling the faint orchid scent in his arms, Su Li's body stiffened slightly. His emotions were slightly disturbed, but he didn't have any distracting thoughts. He only felt a trace of sadness as he thought of the days when he cooked for his uncle every day and paid for his prostitutes. Jian Shui left his embrace and laughed cheerfully as she ran towards the golden sea. The unpainted waves just now couldn't stop her. Her laughter was so clear on the quiet beach, like a round crystal that had been washed by the sea for hundreds of millions of years. Su Lu knew why Jian Shui could laugh so happily after hearing the story, but he liked to hear her laugh. They had been together for a long time, and the idol of his dreams was by his side, showing the truest side of her life. The girl's optimistic, cute, simple, and straightforward personality was like a magnet, deeply attracting him. Telling a girl the story of her dead father was a very difficult job. Coupled with the sincere hug from Jian Shui earlier, Su Lu felt a little hot and tired. He unbuttoned his black summer clothes and sat on the chair. He opened a bottle of water and slowly drank from it, but his gaze was always cautiously on the beach. Jian Shui, who was wearing a dark blue swimsuit, had already plunged into the sea like a nimble fish. At this time, the sea was like a piece of raw ore. The surface of the sea was strands of gold, but under the surface was a peaceful and soft blue. The young girl moved stealthily in the sea of blue. Her purple hair had long been swept up by the ripples of the water. She looked like an elf wearing a princess crown woven from water plants. Her slender legs were extremely tight, and from time to time, they would bounce, shining a fresh and attractive white in the sea of blue, like a naughty mermaid's tail. She was very good at swimming, and her movements were extremely natural as she moved stealthily in the sea. Sometimes she would dive into the white water at the bottom of the sea to pick up a shell, and sometimes she would reach into the quiet sea to touch the bold thorn fish. The blue was peaceful, and there was no worldly matter, no noise, that would disturb her heart and her emotions. She laughed silently in the dark blue sea. Her incomparably beautiful face carried undisguised happiness. However, small droplets of water slipped out of her eyes from time to time and slowly rose to the surface of the sea. Under the illumination of the twilight that penetrated the sea, they were like pearls that kept pouring out. In ancient fairy tales, the tears of a mermaid could not be seen because they mixed with the sea water when they flowed out. However, the tears that flowed out of her smile were so clear in this blue sea. Chapter 394. Ever since the story at the seaside, the relationship between Su Lu and Jian Shuer had changed imperceptibly. The awkwardness that hadn't been completely eliminated at the red wine night had long been blown away by the sea breeze. The innate closeness between the two gradually became a kind of reality. Because of the dead middle-aged man, they had a sense of family. There was no need to talk about the subtle feelings between a young man and a young woman. Su Lun naturally regarded the former idol of his dreams as a sister who needed to be protected and loved the most. In the corner of the luxurious penthouse suite, there was a private space of about 80 square meters. The colorful optical fibers in the glass interlayer formed an abstract and incomprehensible picture, making the people sitting in the living room completely unable to see the content inside. Su Lu, Jian Shuier shouted from behind the colorful picture glass wall. "Are you coming with me to the press conference in the afternoon?" "Yes," Su Lu replied. "Can you help me take a look at my outfit?" Jian Shuier poked her head out from behind the glass wall and waved at him with a giggle. "Didn't you say that I have no taste last time?" Su Lu scratched his head and walked over obediently. Looking behind the glass wall at the national girl who was looking left and right in front of the mirror, he thought that there were several designers and stylists in the performance team. How could he see anything? Standing in the living room, Sister Tong, who was confirming the itinerary, slowly put down the phone in her hand, and a strange expression appeared on her face. Behind her stood two female assistants who had been with Jian Shuier for 6 years. Their expressions were extremely dull. Thinking of the night on the warship and the bits and pieces of the past 2 days, their hearts couldn't help but beat faster. After swimming at the seaside, Sister Tong keenly noticed that the relationship between the Miss and Su Lu had undergone some subtle changes. It was not necessarily in terms of feelings, but it was unusually shocking. When Jian Shuier went to the capital alone to shoot a TV series at the age of 12, she was sent by the Ministry of Defense to protect her. This was the first time she saw the Miss treat a member of the opposite sex so unguarded. In the past 2 days, although Jian Shuier and Su Lu did not have many opportunities to be alone together, the details of their actions and the strangeness in their tone were still noticed by many people in the team, such as at this very moment. Jian Shuier looked at Su Lu in the mirror and couldn't help but squint her eyes and laugh at him. "Ah, why are you blushing?" The outfit she had prepared today was a scarlet female imitation vest paired with a knee-length plain short skirt. The skirt was decorated with complicated three-dimensional embroidery, which completely changed the style of the outfit. It was just that it looked a little redundant. But what was amazing was that when this purple hair girl wore it, the redundancy actually became a big piece of beauty. The problem was that at this time, she was holding the top with one finger and did not put it on. Her upper body was only wearing an emerald green tube top. This conservative tube top couldn't be considered underwear, as the places that should be covered were all covered. However, the soft material of the garment clearly reflected the soft curves of the young girl's chest, especially the naked, fragrant shoulders and the slim waist, which revealed a delicate and youthful sexiness. Su Lu had an awkward expression and put on his sunglasses indoors. Although the relationship between him and this superstar was very close, she was still his dream lover. Suddenly seeing such a beautiful scene, his heart would always beat a little strangely. But he didn't expect that he would blush. "Don't peep with your sunglasses. Be careful that I will sue you in court. You know, the Children's Rights Protection Fund didn't even win a lawsuit against me." After experiencing a scene similar to a reunion, Jian Shuier didn't mind showing the loveliness that she usually only showed in front of the people closest to her in front of Su Lu. She often smiled and stuck out her tongue to act cute. It was probably because Su Lu was the student of the father that she had never met before. This deepened the sense of closeness and trust that originally existed. Today, Su Lu naturally knew the truth of the lawsuit that shocked the entire Federation. Jian Shui'er hid her identity and went to the capital alone to enter the Federation television station. The elders of the Feiqing family didn't know how to be angry, but this girl cast a clear and stubborn temperament from then on. Her family had no way to deal with her, so they thought of pushing the children's fund behind the scenes to sue the Federation television station. With the military as the background, the children's fund naturally fought the lawsuit heroically. In the end, even senior officials in the president's residence were sued by them. However, in the end, it was Justice Ying who declared that Jian Shui'er could choose her own life, and the old man in Feiqing had no choice but to accept this point. The general public of the Federation only knew that Jian Shui'er won the lawsuit, but they didn't know that she won the invincible Federation army god. It was like countless burning suns. Su Li's eyes squinted under the constant flashes of the photographers. He squinted extremely hard as he thought to himself. Behind the photographers was the press conference hall of the Venus Hotel. Today, the publicity officials of the West Woods Frontline Military Command and the guests who came from afar would jointly hold a press conference about the victory concert. The military sent Major General Chun, who was in charge of publicity matters in the 4th Military Region, to express its absolute importance. As for the performance team, as the only protagonist, Jian Shui'er, the national girl, naturally had to be present in person. Thinking of this press conference outside of the itinerary, Su Lu felt a little strange. The storm 3 days ago could have been settled with a phone call, but under the joint performance of Zhong Erlang and Madman Li, it became a story that shocked the entire upper class of the West Woods. In this case, Jian Shui'er's itinerary could no longer be kept secret from the public. After an emergency discussion, the military decided to release the specific details of the concert in advance and create momentum. After all, this was a victory concert intended to inspire the morale of the entire Federation and to promote the war with the Empire. It couldn't be held quietly. In the flashes, Jian Shui'er walked along the corridor and waved to the reporters, which caused a frenzy. It had been more than a year since she left the Federation stage, and not a single media outlet had been able to dig up any information about her. Many of her fanatical admirers even thought that this national girl might quit the entertainment industry. They were so sad that they couldn't help themselves. Who would have thought that she would suddenly appear in the West Woods and announce that she would be holding a comeback concert soon? Of course, it attracted the attention of countless news reporters. Naturally, the reporters from the Capitol Ring couldn't make it. Most of the reporters present today were military reporters, and they didn't expect to be so lucky. It should be known that the name of the national girl represented ratings and news effect, whether it was the long-lasting lawsuit, the 2 concerts that were accompanied by explosions, or her every appearance. There is a saying that it was often difficult for a girl star to control the stage, but Jian Shui'er was obviously an exception. She was calm and gentle, and showed the most beautiful side of a star. But no one would have thought that at this time, she was asking, "What time is the spaceship taking off? Is the West Woods roast lamb leg that you promised to treat me in time?" In the cameras of the reporters, the national girl's lips were slightly open, revealing her white teeth. Her smile was exceptionally bright, and no one thought of the question that she was thinking at this time. The expressions of the people around her were slightly strange, but they heard this sentence and guessed who she was talking to. They all looked at Su Lu behind her. Su Lu nodded. Most of the members of Team 7 had already taken control of the key positions at the press conference. In addition to the members who stayed behind and Su Lu, there were 4 people in black suits who followed Jian Shui'er. Amid the flashes and clamor, the 4 members clearly heard the 2 sentences of the conversation, and the expressions on their faces were slightly strange. Just like Sister Tong, the members of Group 7 also felt that there was something strange between their boss and the national girl. When they heard these 2 sentences that sounded very normal, they couldn't help but think to themselves, if there's nothing going on between them, who would believe it? Apart from the silent criticism, the members of Team 7 actually felt proud in their hearts. They were even prouder than when Su Lu had destroyed the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division. There were countless soldiers in the Federation, but when it came to fighting strength, Team 7 was definitely not afraid. Now that their boss had gotten the national girl that everyone adored, this kind of fighting strength. Who could compare to this kind of fighting strength? A publicity officer of the West Woods Military District acted as a guest host and smiled as he described the general itinerary of Miss Jianshuer, but he was unwilling to disclose the specific time and location of the victory concert. He pointed outside the window to a large building under the Tsang Mountains that faced the sea and said loudly, "When a victory concert is held, the Tsang Mountain Stadium will be broadcasted live. The local stars of the West Woods and the special representatives of the military will participate." The reporters understood the meaning of these words. The Tsang Mountain Stadium was grand and magnificent, but it was actually just a side venue. Someone asked, "Where is the main venue of the victory concert?" The host deliberately paused for a moment and then said firmly, "It is my honor to inform everyone that Miss Jianshuer will personally go to the front line and sing for the brave soldiers of the Federation." The press conference suddenly quieted down. The West Woods was the front line of the Federation, but the real front line was the planets that were full of smoke and fire. Most of the reporters present were military reporters, so they naturally knew the danger that the two words front line represented. Jianshuer had been quiet and even seemed to be obedient as she sat behind the table without saying a word. At this time, countless cameras were activated again, and only the sound of small motors could be heard in the silence. After a moment of silence, a reporter asked with a serious expression, "Is the military confident in Miss Jianshuer's safety? Also, the victory concert will be held at the front line." "Which front line exactly?" "You also said that the military is very grateful for Miss Jianshuer's bravery. In order to protect her safety, we cannot disclose the specific location of the concert," the host answered. This explanation made the reporters immediately stop asking questions. They were all reporters who ran the military line and were very clear about the importance of safety. Su Lu had been standing silently in the shadows below the stage, 5 meters away from Jianshuer, ready to rush up to rescue her at any time. He quietly looked at the unfamiliar scene of the press conference and suddenly felt a little strange, because it was obvious that a few reporters began to secretly take pictures of him after whispering a few words. Chapter 395. Until the end of the press conference, the accident that Su Lu was worried about didn't happen. In a foreign land, although he had the full cooperation of the military, it was very difficult to completely control the entire hotel and eliminate all potential dangers with only a dozen men from Group 7 and dozens of guns. He had to be careful. On the rostrum, Major General Chun, who was in charge of the 4th Military Region, had just finished his passionate speech. His words were full of passion and provocation, and even the veteran military reporters were encouraged to rush to the front line immediately to see how the Federal Army would sweep away the remnants of the Imperial Expeditionary Army that were holed up on the peripheral planets like the autumn wind sweeping away the fallen leaves. Then Jianshuer expressed her feelings after coming to the West Woods. At this time, even she noticed that some reporters under the stage seemed to be secretly taking photos of Su Lu, and more people were taking photos. Su Lu wore sunglasses and let the reporters take photos with a blank face, but he had a lot of doubts in his mind. What happened? However, as the head of security, he couldn't leave Jianshuer's side in this kind of complicated situation. During the question and answer session before the end of the press conference, the reporters of the Federation, who had always been protective of Jianshuer, finally bravely broke the past convention and pointed to Su Lu in the corner and asked, "Miss Jianshuer, please forgive us for being presumptuous, but we really want to know, this gentleman, what is your relationship with you?" Even if Su Lu was a thick-skinned person, he still couldn't help but be shocked when he suddenly became the target of thousands of people's accusations. Major General Chun on the rostrum frowned and wondered if these reporters actually knew the true identity of Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. The reporters who didn't know the inside story were curious about the question of their colleague, and the members of the performance team and the security team were curious about their curiosity. Only the reporters who had just received the news were really curious about Jian Shui's answer. Of course, they thought that this national girl would answer as flawlessly as usual, cute and amiable. So when they heard Jian Shui's real answer, there was a burst of incredulous exclamations in the room. Jian Shui opened her big eyes and looked at the reporter curiously. After a slight pause, she seriously replied, "He is my friend." The Golden Star Hotel was a military property, so the 4th Military Region sent a lot of soldiers to maintain order. Fortunately, the riot of reporters, who was almost triggered by Jian Shui's answer, was blocked behind the corridor. They could only watch the mysterious man in sunglasses and Jian Shui disappear in the corridor. Back to the suite on the top floor, Sister Tong turned on the TV and the internet as quickly as possible. Everyone looked at the headlines on TV and the large, eye-catching words in the online community. Only then did they understand why the reporters were in such a commotion today. Jian Shui held her slightly hot cheeks with both hands and gently stuck out her tongue. She looked at Su Lu and smiled. Sorry for the trouble. Previously, when she answered the reporter's question and said that Su Lu was her friend, it was purely natural. According to her usual image of a cute national girl in the Federation, it was easy for the reporters and audience to accept her security director as a friend. However, the word friend seemed rather inappropriate today. In the studio of the Federal News Channel, the female anchor, who was usually very serious, had a spring in her eyes and a smile on her red lips. The nation's young lady, Jian Shui, has not appeared in front of the public since the terrorist attack in the 4 provinces. Now that the mastermind behind the terrorist attack has been punished by the law, our cute national girl has appeared again. But this time, she appeared in the West Woods. According to the Department of Defense's press release, we learned that Miss Jian Shui will hold a concert called Victory in the West Woods. As for the specific situation, we will send the live broadcast of the concert press conference later. And this morning, an explosive news about the national girl appeared on the Federation's network in advance. The female anchor zoomed in on the photo in the background and said with a smile, "This is the exclusive beach of the Golden Star Hotel in the West Woods. Someone accidentally took this photo." The photo zoomed in on the Federation News Channel was a bit blurry. It seemed that the person who took the photo didn't use professional equipment, but it could still be clearly distinguished that the girl hugging a young man in front of the blue sea and white sand was Jian Shui. At that time, Jian Shui was only wearing a dark blue swimsuit. The intimacy was obvious. If I remember correctly, this is the first time the national girl appeared in a swimsuit in public. A white-haired old man in the studio said with a smile. The Federation girl has grown up after all. She has indeed grown up. The female anchor said with a smile, "I think that countless families in the Federation have watched her grow up day by day since she was 12 years old. They must have been waiting for the day when the national girl fell in love. But they didn't expect that this day would come so suddenly." Sister Tong and her 2 female assistants looked at Jian Shui on the sofa and Su Lu standing beside her with a complicated expression. Jian Shui was actually watching the news with great interest, and Su Lu didn't seem to be affected by it, but his expression was a bit ugly. The photo that was taken in secret first appeared on the public network of the Federation and immediately raised a huge uproar. Even the news channels of the major TV stations that had always been serious immediately produced special programs to review Jian Shui's brilliant career. Then, with a warm tone, they began to speculate about the love affairs of the national girls. There was no telling how many uncles and aunts were crying because of it. The West Woods was so far away from the capital ring that the people in the penthouse suites didn't know about it until now. Then, the Federation's news channel began to broadcast the news conference. The director kept focusing on Su Lu, who was in the shadows, and at the same time, repeated Jian Shui's response of saying that he was a friend several times. Sister Tong turned off the TV in annoyance, only to find that the situation on the internet was even worse. Everyone was guessing who the love interest of the nation's girl was. There were all kinds of different analyses. Some people guessed that it should be a rich family's son from Givenchy's summer outfit, But more people saw the news conference broadcast earlier and thought that it was a love story that could be compared to a movie's bodyguard and a celebrity. Sulu lowered his head and looked at the black Givenchy summer clothes he was wearing. He thought that it was time for him to change his clothes. Just like how the Federation's news channel created a warm and positive tone for the news, most people on the internet followed the development of the situation with a kind attitude. But there were also some fanatical supporters who began to clamor on the internet to find a lucky scum who shamelessly blasphemed the young goddess. Secret photo, leak, storm, acquiescence. This plot is really vulgar. On the road, when they saw Zhong Ziqi's poem displayed on the white Duran limousine, Su Lu and Jian Shi tacitly came to a vulgar conclusion. At this time, as the people involved in the explosive news of the Federation, they looked at each other and came to the same conclusion again. Sister Tong didn't understand what they were talking about. If the old man thinks that he can hide from us like this, he is insulting his intelligence as the god of war. Jian Shui'er helplessly rubbed her forehead and muttered. The Golden Star Hotel was heavily guarded by soldiers. More importantly, the vantage points from which they could see the beach were closely monitored by Team 7. If it wasn't for the military, how could they have taken that photo? Sulu even suspected that someone in Team 7 had taken this photo. After all, it was clearly the military's will to expose this news. The most important evidence was that whether it was the Federation's news channel, other private TV stations, or even the supposedly free internet, their comments on this news were so warm and positive. Other than the actions of the Federation government, or the terrifying influence of the old man. Who could do this? What does the old man want to do? Jian Shui'er held her chin, frowned, and looked at the blue sky outside the window and said, I really want to call back and ask him. Sulu was Feng Yu's student, so the old man liked him very much. He could imagine how much the old man doted on Jian Shui'er over the years. Maybe he was also worried about Jian Shui'er's life. But, after all, he was the Federation's god of war. Why would he personally care about such a small matter? The outside of the Golden Star Hotel was full of cameras. Of course, they were standard equipment for news reporters. Although this was a military property and the security was tight, the other party used the freedom of the press as an excuse, so the Westwood's military couldn't drive all these reporters away. Under such circumstances, the promised barbecued lamb leg for supper naturally fell through. At 11 o'clock that night, the motorcade that had been on standby drove out of the hotel's underground parking lot one by one and drove to the Chongfeng military base again. However, this news couldn't be stopped. At the entrance of the hotel, countless cameras surrounded Jian Shui'er and Su Lu behind her. These reporters from major news media in the West Woods were basically running the military line. While the cultural reporters of the Capitol Ring were still trying to find the identity of the man who hugged Jian Shi, these military reporters, who had a natural advantage, had already keenly found another breaking point. Several microphones were handed in front of Su Lu and almost knocked his sunglasses off. He and the members of Group 7 firmly protected Jian Shui'er in the middle of the group, but they forgot that they were also half a news person now, so they couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Are you Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu? No comment. Su Lu somewhat awkwardly answered according to Sister Tong's instructions, but he was shocked that the reporters recognized him. The eyes behind the sunglasses gradually narrowed. He vaguely caught the real intention of the federal military and the old man to create this news. What did the current Federation need the most? Chapter 396. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, I heard that you are a key engineer in the development of the MX Mecha. A reporter from a weapons magazine asked excitedly. We did not see your name on the MX Mecha list, but we have already confirmed this with many engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department and the technical director of Shangqiu. Please confirm this rumor. Sula stopped in his tracks, slightly stunned. Jian Shi, who was protected by the wall of Team 7 members, smiled apologetically at him and then got into the car, leaving him alone with the reporters. There's also a rumor that you defeated Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng in the MX Mecha's test battle. The reporter who had done his homework shouted before all the other reporters could finish their questions. In this reporter's opinion, being able to interview a soldier who had defeated the descendant of the military god's family was truly a rare opportunity in his career. Moreover, the military reporters based in the West Woods had obtained information on this young man through various means, and they felt that this person carried too much of a legend. The other reporters could not take it anymore. They chased after Su Lu and shouted, "From what we know, you are a student of Professor Shen Yulin at the Husk Institute. Is it because of this relationship that you bravely exposed the plagiarism at the Federal Academy of Science and forced the resignation of the previous dean, Lin Yuanhu?" "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, I heard that you were the one who wrote the teaching materials for the new MX Mecha model for the 4 major military academies. You are an engineer and have not received any systematic mecha operation training. Why does the military have so much confidence in you? And I heard that you were once a mecha instructor at the S1 training base. There are rumors that you are a student of the military god, Marshal Li." This reporter was more daring, but he was not so daring as to recklessly accuse Su Lu of being Li Pifu's illegitimate son. He asked in a sharp voice, "And I heard that President Pabre also admires you a lot. He once invited you into the president's official residence to attend the first family dinner? You are a recipient of the Purple Star Medal. Why have I never seen you wearing it?" Su Lu silently thought that it was just an ordinary dinner. As for the medal, did he have to wear it on his body every day to tell all the passers-by what he had done? He lowered his head and walked forward. However, the distance from the main entrance of the Golden Star Hotel to the designated location was less than 100 meters. Surrounded by these stormy waves of reporters, it seemed so long. It seemed to be much more difficult than breaking into the Iron 7th Division's camp from the top of Blue Pond Mountain. After graduating from a Ministry of National Defense, you successfully broke through the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion with just a new MX Mecha. Do you have any thoughts on this news? You should know that the Iron 7th Division has participated in countless military exercises in the past 10 years and has never failed. It was obvious that not only did the reporter from the Weapons Journal at the beginning do his homework, but the reporters who ran the military line only took half a day to get enough information from certain departments in the Capitol Ring. Su Lu thought that this news was too exaggerated. He had only broken into the camp of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion. If he were to face the entire Defense Battalion alone, he would only be able to escape. He wanted to explain a little, but he remembered Sister Tong's order. He could only say that he had no comment and continued to walk with his head down. However, at this moment, a reporter finally asked a question that made him stop abruptly. "According to your classmates, when you were studying at Lin Hai University, you were once in a relationship. The person you were in love with was the spokesperson of the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army, Ms. Zhang Xiaoming, also known as the Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain. Regarding this love story, will it cause any trouble to your military life?" Su Li's body stiffened slightly. He raised his head and looked for the face of the reporter in the flashing lights around him. The noisy scene suddenly quieted down because of his actions. However, after a moment of silence, he did not say anything in the end. In the silence, a reporter finally mustered up the courage to ask again, "As the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, why did the Ministry of National Defense let you work part-time at Whitewater Company? We have all seen your resume and felt that it was a little unbelievable that you became Miss Jian Shuayer Security Director. Are you carrying out a secret military mission? Or—" All the reporters had been waiting to ask this last question. So at this moment, except for the reporter who bravely asked the question loudly, there was absolute silence. Countless flashing lights and microphones were placed in front of Su Lu. "You and Miss Jian Shuayer are really in love?" Su Lu did not answer this question. In fact, the reporters did not need him to answer. As journalists, it was not important whether the interviewee answered or not. The most important thing was that the reporters needed to let the audience and readers know through their own questions that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu had done a lot of great things, and that this person was the love interest of the nation's young girl, Jian Shuayer. In the Capitol Ring, which was extremely far away from the West Woods region, many television viewers were watching the live broadcast on the news channel. However, it was delayed by a few minutes compared to the real-time situation. The image of the young man wearing sunglasses being besieged by the reporters entered the TV screens of thousands of households and caused a commotion. A few hours ago, they had only looked at the photo and were curious and happy to guess the identity of this young man. Now, they learned more from the mouths of these reporters. A rising star of the future in the military, who was likely to become a hero of the Federation in the future, and a nation's young girl who was loved by all the citizens of the Federation. This was truly a match made in heaven. This was a warm, beautiful, and even respectable love story. Respectable was very important. On the top floor of the Samlin Federation Bank in the Capital Special District, Li Xiaozhu turned off the TV. He held a glass of light-colored wine and quietly turned his head. Through the transparent glass curtain wall, he looked at the tens of thousands of lights in the Federation. He thought to himself that there must be many people like him who also saw the previous scene. He took a small sip of the wine and struggled to maintain a calm expression on his face. He did not let the true anger in his heart show. His father, that old man who liked to wear small round hats, often persuaded him to walk down the building and stand on the ground to see the world. However, today, he discovered that no matter where he stood, his heart was the same. On the other side of the towering Samlin Bank building, Li Xiaodong was having dinner in his room, full of flowers. The sound coming from the holographic screen was extremely loud and clear. His expression was extremely happy, and the cold aura of the past that was like snow plum blossoms was swept away. He raised the red wine and looked at the battered and exhausted Su Lu on the news with a smile. He said with a smile, "You're a bit faster than I thought. This glass of wine is to you, and also to my truly battered big brother." The Parliament building was brightly lit. A whole row of offices in the direction of the Stone Hall had now been emptied. They were now the Green Dragon Mountains contact office. For the great reconciliation of the Federation, President Pabre and the big shots of Parliament showed unprecedented sincerity. A young confidential official looked at the girl in the room worriedly. Thinking of the questions of the reporters in the news, he could not help but ask, "Do you want to go eat first? There's so many things that you can't finish in a short time." Zhang Xiaoming gently pushed up the black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose with the tip of a finger. She looked up and said with a smile, "Qingzhou, you don't have to worry about me. I'm fine." She was now the spokesperson of Green Dragon Mountain in the capital ring. She had more important tasks in private and was extremely busy every day. However, her eyes looked through the glasses and fell on the files, but she did not move at all. In fact, she had been listening to the news on the TV and thinking about how the reporters mentioned her. "You deserve better." She hid the sadness in her heart, forced a smile, and officially began to work. In a quiet manner in the capital of Huachin State, a middle-aged woman upstairs was earnestly persuading her young lady, "Mimi, I know you're not happy, but you still have to eat." "I'm not unhappy, it's just, I feel a little nervous." Nan Xiaomei asked the nanny to leave and returned to the table. Looking at the photo that caused the commotion, her beautiful eyebrows slightly wrinkled. She clasped her hands together and softly prayed, "No, don't." The silver-gray light battleship was like a silver shuttle, sailing in the quiet and even quiet space. With the help of the gravitational pull of the giant planet, it accelerated again. After flying through the shadow of the giant planet, the westward sun on the right suddenly shone. Countless golden rays shone on the surface of the battleship. It was not warm, but made people feel a little cold. How does it feel to be on the news? Lan Xiaolong followed behind Su Lu and made fun of him. At this time, they were doing an inspection of the core area of the battleship. Although the Westwoods military would protect the safety of the performing team, there was still a new MX in the core area. The security of Team 7 would not be relaxed because of this. Su Lu waved his hand in annoyance and did not say anything. Then he gently knocked on the door and walked in. Lan Xiaolong looked at the tightly closed door and thought of the national girl in the room. He shrugged and thought, "Is this the shame and anger of the whole Federation after their affair was exposed? I'm very sorry for causing so much trouble for you." Jian Shui turned around from the window and helplessly shrugged with a smile. It was a very similar action. Lan Xiaolong's shrug was like a hooligan, but this girl's shrug was incomparably cute. Sulu stood silently behind her. Right now, the whole Federation saw them as a perfect couple. They knew very well that this was not the case at all, but they could not help but sigh with emotion at the powerful ability of the Ministry of National Defense's publicity department to create momentum. Their hearts were slightly heavy. If it had only been an exclusive interview and deliberate publicity by the military, the media and Federation citizens would definitely not have been so interested in Sulu. This was because whether it was the MX Mecha or any other feats for the average secular society, they would always seem a little distant. But this matter involved the national girl, Jian Shuier, and that was different. The media and citizens would spontaneously unearth everything related to Sulu. Li Feng was on a secret mission at the front lines, so Jian Shuier was unable to contact him. She cocked her head and thought for a while, and then finally dialed Li Jiedu's number. She asked softly over the phone, "Is the marshal not feeling well recently?" "Busy all day, only returning home after 4 p.m. There's really no time to edit this chapter, so I'll just read it like this." Chapter 397. Regarding this news, the people of the Federation had different reactions. After being shocked, they were curious, and after being curious, they gave their blessings. However, among those related to Sulu and Jianshi, Nan Xiangmei was disappointed and sad. Zhang Xiaoming had mixed feelings, and Li Xiuzhu was about to go crazy under his calm expression. The second young master of the West Woods, Zhong Zici, smashed the television angrily. Zhou Yu, who was continuing her studies in Linhai, held her son Zhou Liuhua and looked at the snow outside the window. She sneered, thinking that Su Lu was really a lucky bastard. Su Lu and Jian Shuier had different reactions from everyone else. This was because they knew that this news was fake, so they started to speculate about the origin of this incident, or rather, the intentions of the perpetrator. The more they speculated, the heavier their mood became. In the preparation for the universal war with the Empire, the Federation needed a hero to unite the will of the Federation citizens and mobilize the entire society to fight together. This was the reason they could think of. Of course, Sulu did not have this kind of influence now. He had not even been to the front lines, but whether it was the development of the MX Mecha, his personal combat strength, or his legendary life, he already had some kind of foundation or embryonic form. As the saying went, everything was ready, except for the east wind. The only thing he lacked now was outstanding military achievements. If there were no accidents, the Iron 7th Division and their commander, Du Shaoqing, would be another Federation hero and collective hero created by the cooperation of the president and the military. However, the part that Su Lu represented could not be replaced. This was because he had once displayed that kind of heroic spirit during the assassination of Macklin. Within the Federation, on the battlefield, this kind of heroic spirit was severely criticized. However, in terms of publicity, this kind of spirit was what the military's propaganda department needed the most. It must be known that many years ago, when the Federation's expeditionary army was in desperate straits and society was in turmoil, it was Li Pifu's most famous act of heroism that turned the tide. The people of the Federation liked this kind of person and needed this kind of person to inspire the courage in their hearts and overcome the fear of the Empire's invaders. The Federation needed a hero, so they would create one. They had already built a large stage for Su Lu on the battlefield. They were just waiting for him to control his mecha and slaughter his enemies. At that time, they would once again activate the propaganda machine and paint his military uniform with a layer of golden light that could not be looked directly at. Of course, this would depend on Su Li's future performance on the battlefield. War God Li Pifu was a hero created by the collective will of the Federation many years ago. But if it wasn't for this legendary character who had written countless legendary stories that were difficult to replicate, what use would the Federation's propaganda machine be? However, the Federation already had War God Li Pifu. Why were they already preparing for something that would happen many years later? My brother said that the marshal's health is quite good. I don't know if it's true, Jian Shui said worriedly as she hung up the phone and frowned slightly. She was worried about the same thing as Su Lu, so she no longer referred to the war god as old man. War godly Pifu's health condition was definitely the most important matter in the Federation. It was also the highest level of secret. Although they were the descendants of that old man, they could not be completely sure. 197 Federation standard hours later, the light warship left the core star region of the West Forest region. Under the protection of a Federation fleet, it quietly entered the Huiming corridor. After flying in space for a period of time, they could see a planet with an extremely strange color appear above the porthole. This planet was of average size. Because of the tilt angle, the planet's surface received extremely uneven sunlight. They could clearly see that 1/3 of the surface of the northern hemisphere was covered in ice and snow, while 2/3 of the lower hemisphere was green and blue. It was very beautiful. Every 3,000 years, this planet will automatically correct its tilt angle. The snow and ice in the northern hemisphere will melt in large amounts and rush into the low-lying areas in the southern hemisphere, bringing the most spectacular and terrifying ice flow. Bai Yulan stood beside Su Lu and explained softly, "The early developers of the Federation paid an extremely heavy price in order to establish an administrative region on this planet. At that time, Commander Zhong of the Westwoods region asked the people who developed the planet to ignore the ice flow. So this most remote administrative planet of the Federation was named 5460. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the planet. Although his eyes were sharp, he still could not see the Empire's warship on the other side of the planet. However, he knew that the Empire's people were there. The Empire's expeditionary force had established a base in the northern hemisphere of 5,460, and the location of Jian Shui's victory concert was in the southern hemisphere. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the lonely planet in space. He suddenly said, "It wasn't until I got the details of the plan that I found out that the Empire's expeditionary force still occupied the 3 administrative planets in the Westwoods region." He turned to look at Bai Yulan and asked, "When I was young, I watched the news on TV. I only knew that the Federal Army was invincible and that the Empire's people were defeated. I thought that these beasts had been driven to the mineral planets where it was difficult to survive. Why didn't the Federation ever mention these things?" Bai Yulan explained softly, "This is necessary for publicity. As long as the military is not determined to take back the 3 administrative planets occupied by the Empire, they will deliberately downplay this fact. When the Empire's expeditionary force attacked, most of the residents had already evacuated, and the 3-star systems, including 5460, were too remote. It was easy to forget. What about the Federation's news media? Most of the people evacuated, which means that there must be some people left on those planets. Our compatriots fell under the iron hooves of the Empire's people. After so many years, did no one think of rescuing them?" Su Li's furrowed brows were full of shock and doubt. Bai Yulan replied, "This is the desolate edge of the universe. It is the outermost area of the Federation's colonization and development. It is not very valuable. The most important thing is that without the close protection of the military, the reporters cannot enter the front lines. I can roughly understand. If the news media agitates too much and the military is not prepared, they will be kidnapped by public opinion and launch a counterattack. It is very likely to destroy the entire plan, but it feels a little strange." Su Lu slowly lowered his head and looked at the white, green, and blue tricolor planets that were getting closer and closer. He said, "In order to bypass the Gary Corridor and the Night Scorpion Nebula, the Empire did not hesitate to spend 7 years on long-distance space travel to launch a magnificent expedition. But this is the Federation. We have the glory of the Charter. How can they still survive? 6 years and 9 months. Bai Yulan reported a time that all the Federation's soldiers remembered. The Empire Expeditionary Force needs 6 years and 9 months to leave the mainland and reach the Westwoods. In the decades after the First Space War, the successive emperors of the Empire sent 3 million soldiers to invade the West Woods. This is equivalent to 2/3 of the Federation's total number of soldiers at the same time. In the face of such powerful invaders, the Federation and the glory of the Charter made them pay a heavy price. Now, there are at most 700,000 people left, and they are scattered across 3 galaxies. Speaking of the glory of the Charter, the first thing any Empire soldier has to do when invading a Federation planet is to destroy all the aircrafts and official electronic devices of the Federation in the controlled area of the planet. This is because they know better than us how terrifying the Charter is. They want to destroy the eyes and ears of the Charter. Sulu is thoughtful. Yes, but they have spent decades and only managed to make the space above their heads slightly safer. Bai Yulan smiled elegantly, but her smile was full of mockery. It was unknown whether she was mocking the Empire's people or the Federation's big shots. She continued, "The Federation has never admitted that any territory has been occupied because of this. Without the glory of the Charter, of course, cannot be considered as the Federation's territory." T logic. Sulu shook his head. Unknowingly, all the members of Group 7 stood behind Sulu and Bai Yulan. Even the staff of Jian Shue'er's performance team walked out of their respective rooms. Dozens of people silently looked at the planet that was becoming clearer and clearer outside the porthole. They could even faintly see the bright lights that occasionally lit up at the boundary between light and dark on the planet. Hydralisk 2 bomb dense firing array. Xiong Linquan stared at the lights in a daze and said subconsciously, whether it was the first time for people to come to the real front line or not, at this moment, they could feel a solemn and bloody aura spreading from the inconspicuous planet in front of them. Because this planet was 5,460, a battlefield, in the boundary between the glaciers and forests in the northern hemisphere of the planet, a circular defense base was hidden in the middle. Countless heavy firepower weapons were placed behind the base's bulletproof automatic armor. Within a radius of 130 kilometers around the base, there were also countless sophisticated radar arrays and carefully disguised mechas. The resources transported from the controlled mineral planets were not enough to support the daily logistics of this army. Therefore, whether it was the base or the densely packed barracks, the buildings were often built with local materials. Although they were sturdy, they looked particularly simple and crude, and they couldn't reflect the royal style that these soldiers were most passionate about. The heavy alloy gate on the ground slowly opened. The black 3-speed space missile painted with hibiscus patterns followed the precise positioning of the radar and slowly adjusted its direction. With the command of the commander, the base of the giant missile began to spew out flames. The powerful driving force made the whole earth begin to tremble. The forest was filled with the angry, protesting cries of native animals. The missile dragged a long white tail and flew at high speed toward the dark sky. It was impossible to see its target with the naked eye. It seemed that this missile powered by liquid hydrogen fuel could only penetrate a large hole in the sky of the planet, and then powerlessly break free from the gravitational force and drift forever in the quiet and gloomy universe. Target hit. A soldier wearing an old gray coat and a mink hat looked at the display on the master control system, coughed violently twice, and numbly reported, the enemy's self-changing orbit satellite was successfully destroyed. In front of the command room, the senior general with an aged face held a cup of hot tea and drank 2 mouthfuls. His eyes were a little cloudy and lifeless as he sighed with a hoarse voice. Sometimes I really envy those guys in the South for being rich. Orbit-changing satellites are so expensive. They know that we will definitely take them down, but they still put them on top of us every day. Chapter 398. The officers were originally silent and indifferent, but when they heard the words His Majesty, it was as if they were struck by an electric current. With a whoosh, all of them stood up and performed a military salute in unison, shouting loudly, "Long live His Majesty." His voice echoed in the empty command room and did not disappear for a long time. The officers, who had been tortured by years of war and homesickness, were about to go crazy. Even if they were not really excited in front of their colleagues, their faces were still red. It seemed that if they did not do this, they would not be able to show their fanatical loyalty to His Majesty. Unfortunately, one of the officers could not hold back his coughing, and the continuous coughing slightly diluted the fanaticism in the room. "Norman, if you're sick, just rest. Those things will naturally be taken care of by the ground forces. If it really doesn't work, those few pitiful warships in space can still chase after them." After the officers sat down, the old general looked gently at the coughing officer and said this. But from the corner of his eyes, he noticed that the officers under him had returned to their previous numb expressions. The Federation soldiers in the South dreamed every day of reconstructing the glory of the Charter in the Northern Hemisphere, sending out satellites and electronic surveillance equipment regardless of the cost. The Imperial Expeditionary Force in the Northern Hemisphere fought every day, and the two sides seemed to have formed some kind of tacit agreement. Every time at a fixed time, they would put on a show of air guns and air balloons. The old general did not blame the numbness of the officers under him. No matter who it was, to stay on a planet so far away from home for so many years, fighting a war that was not tragic, but particularly lingering every day, they could only gradually fall into a state of boredom. "I'm fine." The officer called Norman had the most common surname in the Empire. He coughed twice, walked in front of the old general, and said, "General, the clearing of the forest today is a little slow. Should we send out the backup mecha battalion?" To prevent the Federation from reconstructing the glory of the Charter, other than the spacecrafts and satellites in space, what was more troublesome for the Imperial Expeditionary Force was the small automatic electronic surveillance equipment that the enemy used the large transport aircraft to spread in the forest. Although they could find and destroy these annoying little things through frequency detection, there were too many of them. 3 mecha squadrons were needed to clear them out every day. "Do as you see fit. If we don't clean up, we won't be able to sleep peacefully." The old general smiled gently. The computer system in the command room suddenly beeped. An officer quickly walked over and submitted an enemy intelligence report. According to the electronic surveillance, 11 minutes ago, a light warship under the escort of a federal fleet landed at Zuchio Airport in the Southern Hemisphere. The old general put on his spectacles, which had been badly worn out, and read carefully for a while. Then he shook his head and said with a smile, "Which big shot of the Federation do you think is in this warship?" "I can't guess, but it shouldn't be their reinforcements." The Norman officer shook his head. "You should pay more attention to the Federation's news, even though their language is a bit difficult to learn." The old general smiled and said, "The one who came today should be their national girl. I didn't expect that the venue of the concert would be here." The old general said, "That's not important, but there has been a lot of activity in the South recently. They should be sending more troops." A hint of vigilance flashed through the pale blue eyes of the Norman officer as he asked, "What should we do?" The old general smiled and said, "We won't do anything. This circular defense base was the largest military base of the Imperial Expeditionary Force on planet 5460. The headquarters of the Maplewoods Alliance was located here. In the Empire's military system, the Alliance had 5 brigades under it. Its military strength was basically equivalent to an army of the Federation. As for special wartime equipment like the Expeditionary Force, it had more people. The old general, who had just walked out of the command room and was walking toward the edge of the forest with the accompaniment of an orderly, was none other than the commander of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's Maplewoods Alliance, Lieutenant General Ambley. This was the northern hemisphere of the planet, close to the glaciers that had only slightly melted once every 3,000 years. Although the base was at the edge of the forest, it was still cold, and most of the trees were coniferous. It had snowed last night, making it extremely difficult to walk. Ambley refused the help of the orderlies and walked with great difficulty, one step at a time. As one of the most important military leaders of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, He knew very well that the Federation was preparing for a major operation. In the past few months, the frequency of warships taking off and landing in the Southern Federation base was clearly much higher than before. However, this general was as stable as a snowy mountain and did not intend to do anything. With the current situation of the Expeditionary Force, he could not do anything. The Expeditionary Force's auxiliary space fleet could at most defend the northern skies, but they could not stop the enemy's reinforcements. In fact, if it were not for the fact that the Federation was already lacking in crystal resources, this old general really could not imagine how many days his lone army could last under the continuous bombardment of the Federal fleet's main cannons. The Empire had been sparing no expense in its huge financial and material resources to bypass the Night Scorpion Nebula and send an endless stream of soldiers and weapons to the front line of the Westwoods. However, the old general knew in his heart that the Empire's interstellar transportation capacity had long been squeezed to the limit. If the domestic production capacity could still support such a costly expedition, then the interstellar transportation, which was already behind the Federation to begin with, was on the verge of collapse. Old General Ambley turned around and looked at the glaciers and snowy peaks behind the base, deep in thought. Since the first day the Imperial Expeditionary Force occupied Planet 5460, the four commanders of the Maple Forest Alliance had been continuously digging into the glaciers, seeking strategic space and survival space. The old general firmly believed that in this foreign land, even if his army was at a disadvantage in all aspects, as long as he did not make any strategic mistakes, he would definitely be able to persevere. The question was, how many more years did he have to persevere? Strolling in the snowy forest, along the way, countless officers and soldiers saluted this old general, and he warmly returned each and every one of them. The people of the Empire had long hair and were naturally more resistant to the cold. Their eyes were basically blue or brown, and they fought bravely and coldly. Therefore, in the Federation's propaganda, the people of the Empire were often referred to as beasts. Towards this kind of propaganda, the old general would only laugh it off and would not be angry at all. In his eyes, these children who were far away from home were all good children worthy of respect. Walking into the coniferous forest, there was no one else besides his own orderlies. Only then did General Ambley's dark brown eyes reveal a hint of homesickness. The people of the Empire were indeed resistant to the cold, but who would be willing to spend the cold years by the glaciers? Looking at the coniferous leaves above his head and the squirrels running through them, General Ambley suddenly missed the blazing maple forest of his hometown. It had been 20 years since he left his homeland, and 7 years had been wasted in the vast expanse of space. Then there was the continuous war in a foreign land. During this process, he saw too many subordinates, colleagues, and even superiors die. Being far away from the Empire and fighting alone was not a good feeling, especially when there was no hope in sight. General Ambley had always believed that if it weren't for the fact that communication could pass through the nebula, the Expeditionary Force would be able to hear the majestic voice of the Emperor from time to time. If it weren't for the fact that the Imperial instructors used a dry and isolated environment to thoroughly educate the Expeditionary Force officers and soldiers to be patriotic, the Expeditionary Force in the last 3-star systems would have probably surrendered to the Federation long ago. I wonder what the maple forest of my hometown looks like now. The standards of the Federation and the Empire are about the same. The 2 rows of maple trees behind the room should have grown by now. The old general took off his gloves and lightly patted the Federation's winter trees. Thinking about the red leaves of his homeland, a hint of warmth appeared on his aged face. However, he knew that he would probably never be able to go back in this lifetime, and he would never be able to see the red leaves of his hometown again, unless what those idiots in the military said was true. Let's go. The old general turned around and walked towards the direction of the base, but he saw an injured rabbit struggling beside the snow. He smiled and said, "The animals of the Federation are very fortunate. They were raised by them for so many years, but now they are all eaten by us." The orderlies behind him couldn't help but rub their heads and laugh. The Empire had long grasped the technology to extract hydrogen energy. Relying on the iceberg behind them was equivalent to relying on a huge energy warehouse. That was why the Empire's fleet was able to put most of its transport capacity into the supply of soldiers and supplies. Otherwise, relying on the few protein meat production bases of the Expeditionary Force would definitely not be able to satisfy the needs of so many troops. What made the soldiers of the Imperial Expeditionary Force the most excited was that this planet was actually filled with countless wild animals. Although they couldn't be used as rations, it was still a wonderful thing to occasionally have a sumptuous meal. On the way back to the base, General Ambley encountered a group of sentinels. This group of sentinels was supported by 3 moon mechas. They had just captured a Federation scout in the forest. In the current era of modern warfare, scouts were very rarely used. Even if the charter network in the Northern Hemisphere was completely destroyed, the Federal Army would rarely send scouts unless it was to confirm some extremely important information. Only when the Military Intelligence Department didn't dare to completely trust the surveillance equipment would they send scouts to take the risk. The Federation scout had delicate facial features and didn't look very old. When he saw Ambley's military uniform, he instantly knew his identity. He opened his mouth and hurriedly said a few words in pure Empire language. Ambley listened quietly for a moment and exchanged a few words with the officer who had finished interrogating him. He smiled at the Federation scout and said, "We have never taken any prisoners between us. You should know that we, the Empire, don't have any extra food." A look of perseverance flashed across the face of the Federation scout. He forced himself to stand up from the ground, but before he could completely stand up, a gunshot rang out. Blood spurted out of his head, and he fell forward heavily into the snow. General Ambley didn't even look at this common scene. He had already walked forward and asked the orderlies beside him with a smile, "What do we eat tonight? I think that rabbit just now was pretty good." Before he entered the base, the old man's dark brown eyes flashed with a trace of coldness. This was because he noticed that the Norman officer and many people in the command room had walked out of the base. They seemed to be waiting for him. Emergency military report. The Norman officer handed over a top-secret electronic document. General Ambley glanced at it. His expression was extremely gloomy. The old fingers holding the electronic document trembled slightly. He said in a low voice, "When did the military have the right to give orders to the Expeditionary Force's specific military operations? A bunch of idiots." The Norman officer had already forgotten to cough. He said in shock and helplessness, "This is His Majesty's order." Chapter 399. There were 2 space tunnels between the Federation and the Empire. They were located at the outer edge of the Night Scorpion Nebula and the Gary Corridor. Many years ago, when the Federation was increasing its efforts to develop the Westwoods, the Bureau of Proclamation accidentally discovered these 2 warp holes. After a long period of calculation by the central computer, people deduced that the exits of these 2 warp holes should be in the left sky galaxy. For the Federation, which was expanding its territory step by step in an orderly manner, the left sky galaxy was a distant and unfamiliar world. Even with the most advanced exploration spaceship of the Federation, it would take a full 4 years to reach that place. In fact, countless exploration spaceships have been launched by humans to that world, but all of them eventually disappeared without a trace. They had never returned any useful information. This vast sea of stars was filled with countless dangers. The process of humans conquering the universe seemed to be magnificent, but in reality, the number of galaxies that they could come into contact with was still pitifully small. At this time, when they suddenly discovered that they could reach the distant left sky galaxy through these 2 space tunnels, the entire Federation fell into an uproar. Relying on the amazing computing power of the Federal Central Computer, countless generations of space scientists of the Federal Academy of Science had spent hundreds of years to successfully calculate all the data of these 2 space tunnels. The annihilation curvature of the three-dimensional warp and the turbulent period of the violent cosmic ray turbulence in the tunnels were all mapped out. With this precious data of the space tunnels, in addition to the countless years of experience the Federation had in using the warp holes, a fleet that carried the ambition of the Federation to explore the universe slowly entered the space tunnels under the protection of the Army. Then, the Federation was shocked to discover that at the other end of the tunnel, the left sky galaxy, which they thought to be barren, already had a civilization that had developed to its current level. That civilization did not welcome their arrival and was extremely warlike and brutal. Since the first dangerous contact in the last few years of the 36th constitutional calendar, the Federation had firmly controlled the control of the space channel between the Night Scorpion Nebula and the Gary Corridor. Before the Imperium could calculate the data of the space channel, it could never organize a large invasion fleet to break through the Night Scorpion Nebula, which was full of stars and gravitational fields, and the Gary Corridor, which was full of violent ray turbulence. Therefore, the expedition army sent by the violent Imperium could only detour around the Night Scorpion Nebula and spend 7 years and a lot of energy before they could reach the West Woods at the border of the Federation. The reason why the Federation was able to remain stable in the face of the Empire's barbaric and violent invasion was because of the glory of the Charter, which was spread throughout the universe where the Federation was located. The two space passages under their control played an important role. The creator of the universe was a very mysterious existence. Any large fleet that tried to force its way through the shortcuts it created before grasping the rules it left behind would cause the sky to change color and space to become turbulent. However, this universe did not seem to have much interest in those lowly existences it disdained. The space storm caused by any aircraft that entered the space channel was directly proportional to the mass of the aircraft. Although the Imperium was still unable to send an army to break through the space channel, in the past few decades, many brave Imperial Royal Mecha warriors rode simple and crude small spaceships, like ants, quietly and even humbly passed through the space channel under the watchful eyes of the creator of the universe. This was an extremely dangerous attempt. Although the space storm caused by the small spaceships was relatively smaller, the defense of the small spaceships was also extremely weak. Those spaceships that constantly try to sneak through were like a small boat in the ocean. They could be sunk to the bottom of the ocean at any time and never be able to turn over again. Even if the Imperium's special forces were lucky enough to break through the space channel, they would be greeted by the Federal fleet's never-ending surveillance and precision attacks outside the space channel. Only by relying on great strength and unbelievable luck could the Imperium's special forces achieve their tactical objectives. However, they were unable to penetrate deep into the Federation and could only land on the Bermuda mineral planet near Gary Corridor. During this process, for every 100 top-notch special mecha warriors that the Imperium sent out, at most 7 or 8 of them would be able to land on the surface of the Bermuda mineral planet alive. Although there were not many of them, the Federal military would never let their guard down. The mission carried out by the Whitewater Company's combat team and the troops led by Li Feng was to wipe out these fish that escaped the net on these mineral planets. The problem was that these Imperium soldiers who survived the space storm and the pursuit of the Federal fleet usually possessed extremely terrifying individual strength. They were not easy to deal with. The survival rate of big fish, small fish, and shrimps ultimately depended on the size and density of the holes in the fishing net that the fishermen weaved. The two torsional voids, the Night Scorpion Nebula and the Gary Corridor, strictly put the simple philosophical proposition into practice. They allowed the information fragments that wandered between mass and energy to pass through their body freely without reacting at all. That was why the Imperium was able to remotely control the lone expeditionary army outside of 7 years. Although the transmission of military intelligence between the two was difficult, it had never been cut off. In fact, in the center of the highly centralized civilization in the outer left star sector, in the tallest building in the capital of planet Tianjin, There was a person who could even watch the Federation's television news. Of course, compared to the transmission of information with a purpose, this kind of reverse information reception was much more difficult. Although the signals of images and sounds were not destroyed in the turbulence of the space channel, they had become extremely weak. To reassemble such weak signals and send them through the information accelerator to travel through the universe where even light felt distant, the Imperium had expended a large amount of resources and energy. Therefore, other than the Imperial Military Department and the Royal Intelligence Bureau, which were responsible for monitoring the movements of the Federation, only one person among the countless ministers and citizens in the vast Imperium could watch these news programs. In the center of the Empire's Tianjing planet, there was a majestic plaza in the center of countless wide high-grade roads. However, compared to the endless ancient buildings behind it, this plaza seemed ordinary and small. This building complex was the Imperial Palace of the Imperium. For tens of thousands of years, this Imperial Palace had enjoyed the worship of countless planets in the left star sector. It had mercilessly absorbed the blood and sweat of hundreds of millions of citizens, accumulating hundreds of millions of wealth. This was the reason why it was so imposing and innumerable buildings. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, a slightly gloomy palace-style skyscraper rose from the ground and pierced straight into the sky. Together with the continuous development of the dark-colored buildings that covered the entire capital city like a carpet, it was like a sharp sword that drove the subjects on the ground to ask the universe who was the real master. The grandeur was vast and awe-inspiring. In the early years of the Imperium, the famous fleet commander Reger, on a journey back to planet Tianjing, looked at the eye-catching green buildings in the center of the planet from tens of thousands of kilometers away. He had once lamented that this was probably the most magnificent achievement of human civilization that could be seen with the naked eye in the universe. At that time, the Imperium did not know that there were other humans in this part of the universe, and that there was even a deformed society called the Federation. However, even many years later, if the Federation and the Imperium were to be counted, this Imperial Palace on planet Tianjing was still the most awe-inspiring building. If one could look down at the Imperial Palace from a low altitude, the visual impact would definitely be greater. However, for tens of thousands of years, no aircraft had ever dared to fly near the Imperial Palace. There was also no building on this planet that dared to exceed the height of the sword-like building in the Imperial Palace. This was because Her Majesty was in the Imperial Palace. Her Majesty was in Jiaxing Lu. The architectural design of Jiaxing Lu was actually very simple. The bottom floor was as empty as the wilderness, and there were only countless giant pillars supporting it and automated transportation equipment. However, on the top 3 floors of the building, there was a palace that was so luxurious that it was difficult to look at it directly. It was called the Suspended Palace. The violent wind outside the Suspended Palace, after passing through those seemingly weak but actually endowed with high-tech gauze curtains, turned into a leisurely breeze, causing the people living inside to spontaneously feel as if they were riding the wind. They were so happy that they even wanted to pluck the stars from the sky. However, the servants and palace maids did not dare to have any such intoxicated expressions. They humbly maintained a smile and kept their heads down, not daring to look at the situation in the soft couch at the back of the palace. The lighting in the palace was very dim. A young man in a military uniform was half kneeling in front of a screen. His face could not be seen clearly, but his figure was slightly thin and did not look like a strong and powerful soldier of the Imperium. On the screen was a brilliant oil painting of sunflowers, reflecting a shadow. The shadow was raising his hand to rub his head, as if he was complaining endlessly. The group of trash of the News Inspection Department. In fact, they should watch more of the Federation's programs. This was a middle-aged man wearing a large robe. His voice was calm and ordinary, and there was nothing special about it. However, when it fell into the ears of people, it made people feel unusually cold and frightened. The young soldier in front of the screen lowered his head and said in a clear voice, "Understood." The middle-aged man sat on the couch and did not turn his head. Just the back of his figure gave off a suffocating feeling of oppression. He looked at the news conference on the screen and looked at the cute little girl with purple hair. He was silent, as if he wanted to find some memories from her eyes, and he also wanted to find some stories from the bracelet on her hand. His slender fingers stroked the harp beside him, and the low sound of the harp came from behind the screen again, immediately disturbing the sound of the harp. Huai Chaoshi, the young soldier in front of the screen, answered in a clear voice, "Yes. Go and tell that useless uncle of yours. If he insists on letting your even more useless uncle carry out that useless mission, then let him be. I can't be bothered with him." The voice behind the screen said indifferently, "Let Umburi and those guys who are vacationing in a foreign land take back the bracelet on this girl's hand. Capture her or kill her." The young soldier in front of the screen stiffened slightly. He lowered his head and said, "I've already applied to follow the previous mission in secret. Although the risk is high, I've been there once and still came back alive. I believe in your ability." The middle-aged man behind the screen said sadly, "It's a pity that my dear brother will never come back. Prince Delin will definitely be immortal." The soldier named Huai Chaoshi replied softly, "Among all his uncles, only the one who had died in the Federation and whom he had never seen before was worthy of respect." "Yes, eat," the man behind the screen ordered. Huai Chaoshi's body stiffened again. He stood up with some difficulty, walked behind the screen, and picked up a thorn. He lowered his head and stood behind the middle-aged man. A servant had already placed the food on the table. The middle-aged man raised his chopsticks. Huai Chaoshi viciously whipped the thorn in his hand. The thorn fell, and a bloody wound appeared on the middle-aged man's back. "Your Majesty, have you forgotten about the revenge of killing your father?" He grunted in pain, gripped his chopsticks tightly, and replied coldly, "I haven't forgotten." Another thorn viciously whipped down. "Your Majesty, have you forgotten about your brother who left home when he was young?" "No." Slap. "Your Majesty, have you forgotten about the bloodline of the royal family?" "No." A clear voice of reproach sounded in the tallest palace of the Empire's imperial palace. The sound of the thorn hitting the body and the painful reply came one after another from behind the screen. Chapter 400. Does His Majesty not know that this could be a bait? The young officer walked along the path covered with an expensive alpaca blanket and walked out of Jiaxing Tower. He didn't turn back to look at the awe-inspiring Jiaxing Hall. His heart carried a trace of indescribable doubt and uneasiness. Huai Chaoshi. It was said that when His Majesty was naming him, he happened to read a line of poetry. Nostalgia is a line of scribbled poetry. For some reason, His Majesty was deeply moved. From then on, this name had followed him as he grew up day by day. Compared to other Empire soldiers, Huai Chaoshi was on the shorter side. His body was slightly thin, but he didn't feel weak. His military uniform didn't have epaulets to indicate his rank, but the close-fitting cut of his slender body fully displayed the lines of strength hidden in each step he took. Although Huai Chaoshi didn't know why the Federation was so certain that the nation's maiden could move His Majesty so much, he naturally couldn't be sure that this was a trap. However, his military intuition cultivated on the battlefield still made him feel a strong sense of unease. But so what if it was a bait? His Majesty didn't care at all. Whether it was the expeditionary army alone in the West Woods or the palace maids in the glorious royal palace, they were all his people. Thinking of the true anger hidden in His Majesty's calm expression, Huai Chaoshi's thin eyebrows raised slightly. He was sure that His Majesty didn't care at all about the heavy price the expeditionary army would have to pay in order to quell the anger that came out of nowhere. Huai Chaoshi had never doubted His Majesty's ability. Back when His Majesty was still Prince Norton, he didn't hesitate to take the risk and force his way through the space tunnel in the Jelly Corridor just to go to Bermuda and personally awaken the brother hidden in the Federation to complete the huge plan left behind by the great teacher. This kind of thing wasn't something that a normal noble of the royal family could do. Huai Chaoshi stood on the self-propelled track and looked coldly at the entrance to the underground military building in front of the palace. She thought about the uncle in charge of military affairs, and thought that if he were to go through the space tunnel, he would probably immediately get the sanatorium to issue him with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Even with Huai Caoshir's identity, he still had to go through a strict security check before he could enter the underground building of the military headquarters. However, when he walked through the long security check door, the officer in charge of the check immediately destroyed all the scanned images. In the process of destroying them, they didn't even dare to look at the images. His Majesty's orders. In the most secure room in the Empire's military headquarters, Huai Caoshir handed over an electronic signature. She looked at Prince Bowu behind the office desk and said in a deep voice, "Also, His Majesty said that if that guy who only knows how to whip the warriors to vent his anger wants to carry out his first transmigration mission, he can go as he pleases. However, I have to follow him." Prince Bowu was the brother of the emperor and had been in charge of the military headquarters for more than 10 years. As the most powerful military minister of the empire, he looked at the young officer in front of the desk without any arrogance on his face. He even deliberately explained in a gentle tone, "You also know that although some of the data of the space tunnel has been deciphered, it is still too little. Keaton is indeed reckless and competitive, but he has a lot of experience in leading troops. He is more suitable to carry out this kind of first transmigration mission. Also, if you're injured, how can I explain it to His Majesty? But he is also His Majesty's brother and my uncle. Although I insist that transmigration in such a short period of time won't help the situation at the front line, since the military headquarters insisted, I have to follow. I can't just watch him get killed by the Federation soldiers." After saying this, Huai Caoshir coldly saluted and turned to leave. After Huai Caoshir left, Prince Bowu was in a daze behind his luxurious desk for a long time before he woke up. He didn't mind Keaton's impoliteness because Keaton was the son of His Majesty, and Keaton had absolutely terrifying strength to support his indifference. What made him dazed was His Majesty's electronic signature. Such a completely unreasonable military operation was very likely to cause the death of 1/3 of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. What was His Majesty thinking? After a minute, he walked out of the office with a cold face. He successfully digested the shock and returned to his role as the military minister. He passed His Majesty's order to his subordinates and forwarded it to the distant Imperial Expeditionary Force. He himself took the high-speed elevator and came to the hall at the bottom of the military headquarters. Countless military officers were busy in the hall. The computing power of the military headquarters of the Empire was far inferior to the old things in the Federation. The entire hall was filled with the sound of orders, and it was slightly chaotic. Prince Baiwu looked at everything in front of him with a cold face. He had forgotten about the strange military order of His Majesty, because in the past few years, he had spent most of his energy on the 3 most important missions of the Empire, and the hall in front of him was dealing with one of them. Prince Keaton's direct command fleet has already followed the order and will arrive at the designated area in about a month. The fleet has been asking when the portal will be opened. A major general of the Empire came to Prince Bowu's side and said in a low voice. Prince Bowu frowned and thought about what Huai Caoshir said. Keaton was a brave man, but sometimes he was too impulsive, barbaric, and bloodthirsty. Was it too careless to let him carry out such an important transmigration mission? It's just an experimental transmigration. Do you think he dares to kill his way to the capital ring of the Federation? Prince Bowu said sarcastically, "Send an encrypted message to him again. We can only calculate the data curve of the portal within 7 days. If he's really so happy in the Federation star system that he forgets to go home, then he will be captured by the Federation." The Major General nodded. Prince Bowu looked at the busy military officers in the hall with a cold face and felt the pressure and majesty that made him very happy. He enjoyed the taste of war and felt a little regretful. It was a pity that the hero's brother didn't have time to get all the data of the portal. What he sent back 5 years ago was only fragments. Yes, in the hall at the bottom of the Empire's military building, an extremely important project was being carried out. Countless scientists were involved in it, trying to study the data of the portal according to the relevant data that Macklin sent back to the Empire a few years ago. Unfortunately, until today, the biggest progress they made was to calculate the activity pattern of the two portals filled with storms in a short period of time. Once the fleet entered the portal, it would cause a large disturbance to the environment of the portal, and the data model would enter an irreversible range. More importantly, they didn't know if the Federation had the ability to affect the portal. It looks good, but it doesn't have a decisive effect on this war. Prince Bowu thought angrily. Other than the critical 7 days, the research of the military scientists couldn't break through the upper limit of quality. In other words, even if the research was successful, the Empire could only send a medium-sized fleet through the portal again and again. That was equivalent to letting the Federation eat away at their own strength. One day, we will attack the home of these invaders. Prince Bowu opened his mouth slightly and said coldly. At this time, the Major General beside him received a phone call. A hint of excitement appeared in the Major General's eyes. He looked up and said to Prince Bowu, "Your Royal Highness, regarding this experimental transmigration, maybe we have a very good hunting target." Back in the office, Prince Bowu looked at the report that was jointly obtained by the military and the Royal Intelligence Agency. His face showed a hint of disbelief. He said in a deep voice, "The key is the source. I never thought that the military and the Royal Intelligence Agency would be able to get information from the Federation." The head of the Royal Intelligence Agency rubbed his hands excitedly and answered quickly. The information came from Bermuda. It was a direct contact. The source is a hero. His physiological markers have been confirmed. There is absolutely no problem. Hero? This was a great name that was used so much that it was tiresome. But Prince Bowu's eyes lit up, because the Empire's Hero Project was the seed project in the eyes of the Federation government. Prince Bowu narrowed his eyes and said sternly, "It has been many years since he was awakened, especially when the Federation recently discovered this project. How did he awaken on his own?" His Majesty once gave Prince Doring an awakening list. There are not many heroes on the list. Most of them have been identified and arrested by the Federation Bureau of Proclamation. But he is the one who hides the deepest. The head of the Royal Intelligence Agency explained, "The most important reason is that he works in the military's intelligence department. This is very helpful for him to hide himself. No wonder he was able to know the top secret schedule of the federal military." Prince Baiwu said, "Verify the intelligence. If it's correct, let him continue to lurk. Other than the few people on Master Fan's core list, he's probably our only compatriot in the Federation. A mere supply fleet is not worth his sacrifice." Prince Bowu coldly looked at the high-ranking officers in the room. His dark brown eyes flashed with a hint of cruelty. He said in a deep voice, "Let him know the top secret schedule of the federal military as soon as possible." The high-ranking officers in the room were shocked. They did not understand what he meant. Only the Major General who accompanied Prince Bowu to inspect the hall at the bottom level thought of something. Let County King Carlton's fleet slow down. Postpone the test of crossing the space tunnel indefinitely. Prince Bowu stood up and said coldly, "In order to give the Federation a surprise gift, we have to make sure that when the first fleet passes through the space tunnel, we will cause them unbearable losses." The officers in the room slowly came to their senses. The head of the Royal Intelligence Agency asked with a trembling voice, the target of the surprise attack. "Who should we target? If Li Pifu is going to the Westwoods, that would be the best. But that old guy only knows how to hide at home like a turtle," Prince Bowu said coldly. "Other than him, there's only the tiger in the Westwoods." The Empire's research on the space tunnel could only allow a mid-sized fleet to make a round trip in 7 days, unless they wanted to give up on that fleet. Just like what Prince Bowu said before, this kind of result looked good in the war between the two forces, but in reality, it had no strategic significance. But everything was changed because of that seed. If they knew the top secret schedule of the federal military, 7 days, a mid-sized fleet seemed to be able to complete a bloody surprise attack that the Federation would never expect. It's hard to write, and it's not good. I admit it. The story is in my heart, but it's hard to write it out. Reporting to everyone, I will only write 2 chapters today. I will continue to be invincible tomorrow. Even I feel embarrassed to say it, but I will definitely write 3 chapters tomorrow. This is because I have to write 1 more chapter than the 8 days before the end of the month that I promised last time. When I write a completely new plot, there's a bit of a bitter feeling. Although I often tremble with excitement from thinking about the follow-up plot in my head, but it is really a headache to write out the story in my head. The most important thing is that I need to reconstruct a familiar structure in my head, especially when it comes to military affairs. I've always been lacking in them. When I was writing about Qin Yunian, I deliberately practiced in this area and improved. Then, I was very masochistic in writing about spies. This is a guy who uses firearms. I'm just like Emperor Huai, Fu Chai. Let me think about how to fight this battle tonight. Perhaps I'll still choose a different perspective and use a borderline narrative. Please don't misunderstand this phrase. Good night, everyone. I will continue to think. I thought about the night before when I wrote 2 chapters. I wrote the outline until 2:30 at night. My thoughts were clear, and I felt very good. I hope I can have the same feeling later. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.